Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, this is Lieutenant Lynch. May I help you?
Yeah, there's 75 men around our building, and they're shooting at us in Mount Carmel.
Mount Carmel?
Yeah, tell them there are children and women in here and to call it off.
All right. Hello? I hear gunfire. Oh, shit. Hello? Who is this? Hello?
Call it off.
Who is this? Hello? Yeah, this is Lynch.
Hey, Lynch?
Yeah.
That's kind of a funny name there.
Huh?
Oh, listen, no, look.
Now, who am I speaking with?
This is David Koresh.
Okay, David.
The notorious. What did you guys do that for?
Well, David, what I'm doing is I'm trying to establish some communication links with you.
No. Let me tell you something.
Yes, sir.
You see, you brought a bunch of guys out here and you killed some of my children. We told you we wanted to talk. No, how come you guys try to be ATF agents? How come you try to be so big all the time?
Okay, David.
Now, there's a bunch of us dead. There's a bunch of you guys dead. Now that's your fault.
In 1993, in Waco, Texas, a religious community by the name of the Branch Davidians were surrounded by American law enforcement, the ATF and the FBI. 51 days later, 86 people were dead, lives were ruined, and American history was changed. My name is James Philip Arnold with the Reunion Institute. I'm here today with 3 other scholars who have studied the Waco events, and we're going to have a discussion on exactly why this happened, could it have been prevented, so that you will understand this event better and better.
So thanks, Phil. I'm James Tabor. I teach at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, not Chapel Hill, and I'm in the Department of Religious Studies. But I specialize in ancient Christianity, early Christianity and ancient Judaism. So that's a long way from Waco, 1993, chronologically and geographically. But what I deal with in early Christianity in particular is prophecy belief and apocalyptic ideas, groups that think the world is drawing to a close. Jesus was one of those prophetic types. He was a messianic apocalyptic preacher. So I specialize in Jesus. But I've covered groups all through history. So that's essentially what I do. Catherine.
I'm Catherine Wessinger, professor of the history of religions at Loyola University, New Orleans. And I work in a couple of fields of research. One is millennialism studies. And millennialism is the belief that people might have that we are imminently going to move into a collective salvation. There will be some sort of transition to a collective salvation. And I also work in the area of new religious movements. So I'm co-general editor of a journal titled Nova Religio, the Journal of Alternative and Emergent Religions. In response to the event involving the Branch Davidians, I published 2 books. One is an edited book titled Millennialism, Persecution, and Violence, subtitled Historical Cases. And the second one is a book titled How the Millennium Comes Violently, From Jonestown to Heaven's Gate. And both of those were published in 2000.
I'm Stuart Wright. I'm a professor of sociology and chair of the Department of Sociology, Social Work, Criminal Justice at Lamar University. I've been studying new religious movements since the late 70s, early 80s, and by the time of the 1993 federal siege of the Branch Davidians, I'd already been studying new religious movements for over a decade, and particularly interested in government raids on new religious movements, which I went on to work more specifically and write. I have a particular interest in the intersection of religion and violence. So that has attracted me as well. I did publish a book on the Branch Davidian siege entitled Armageddon in Waco. It was published by University of Chicago Press in 1995.
Well, I know I'm with very capable people here, great scholars. As I say, I'm Phil Arnold with the Reunion Institute in Houston, Texas. I have a master's degree in American history, in which I specialized in the separation of church and state and how that began in the colonial period. So I've always had a love of the study of how religious groups achieve their own autonomy and how their views are to be respected and how the government should not interfere with them. We have that long tradition in American history, protected by the Constitution. Also, I have a PhD in religious studies, and like Dr. Tabor, I studied apocalyptic groups in the time of Jesus, and that became very helpful to me when I began to see what was happening on television with the Branch Davidians. In fact, that's exactly how I got involved. I was watching television that night, like many millions of Americans, and on February 28th,
it was a Sunday, wasn't it? I think it
well,
was.
yes, it was amazing. It was all over television that a religious group in Waco was being surrounded, and there were shots fired, and people had died, and a religious prophet figure was talking about the end of the age. So naturally, I got very interested in that. To me, it was as if the characters that I had written about in my dissertation had come to life and were prancing around Waco, Texas. Then I realized that lives could be lost. Lives were already lost. And I thought, what can I do to save lives? So that was the initial motivation for me to leave Houston, Texas, and drive to Waco and try to get the authorities' attention in order to help them understand what an apocalyptic group was all about. So I'm very curious how you three scholars got involved. Jim, I know we worked together early. What was your first impression, and how did you get involved with us?
It was really very similar. It was a Sunday. That's why I mentioned Sunday, because Sunday evening, afternoon, you're thinking of starting the new week, and here it is, Sunday. I forgot exactly the time, but my wife called down to me and said, "You need to come to the television right now. There's this crazy guy in Waco. He's quoting the Bible. He's talking about the end of the world, judgments, all sorts of things, the things you study." So I ran to the television. I think it was CNN, and immediately was intrigued with it. And I probably called you, I think, either that night or the next day, because we both, first of all, it's Texas. I'm from Texas. You're from Texas. And I just thought, this is something I really want to get on top of, be aware of.
Well, Catherine, how did you get affected by this, and when did you get involved?
Well, in 1993, I was a working mom. I wasn't watching much TV. My son was 11 years old. So I was teaching at Loyola University in New Orleans. I still teach there. And so I was working and then taking care of my son. So I did not watch it unfold on television, but I did check the newspaper every day to see how the siege was progressing. And during that time, I was hoping the FBI, who took charge of the site after the shootout with the ATF agents, I was hoping that they were consulting experts, knowledgeable experts. And one day on April 19th, I was in class and I wrote the name Branch Davidians on the blackboard, and I used them as an example of a millennial movement. And a student raised his hand and he said, the FBI has carried out an assault with tanks and gas. The place is on fire, the building is on fire, and in his words, no one is coming out. Now, of course, that was inaccurate because 9 people escaped, but 76 people died in that fire. So, of course, I went home and that evening and turned on the television and saw the fire for the first time. And my son still remembers how upset I was on that day because, it was really a very ill-conceived assault. The federal agents were dealing with a religious group who believed that, they believed in the apocalyptic events of the end time. They believed that they would be assaulted and killed in order to fulfill prophecies. So to carry out an assault was just the worst thing they could have done. So that's when I started studying this group in depth.
Yeah, very powerful emotional experiences that led to your wanting to research it and eventually meet some of the survivors.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes. You know, I had 2 books published in 2000, but then after that, I was in a symposium at Baylor University in Waco. Stuart was participating there. And when the symposium was over, Stuart brought in some of the Branch Davidian survivors who live there in Waco. And we sat around in a circle and talked, but then we all retired to the Cracker Barrel.
Yeah.
And that's where I met David Koresh's mother, and for the first time. And, you know, I've got to know a number of the survivors living in Waco. And out of that, eventually, I asked the survivors living in Waco if I could interview them for a oral history project, which resulted in 3 Branch Davidian autobiographies.
Yes.
In their words.
Of course, David Koresh was the leader, the prophet of the community. Stuart, how did you get involved with this situation?
Yeah, so I was at home watching TV, and just like most people, but I remember in the first week or so, as the FBI moved in to take over the situation from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and the hostage or crisis negotiators began to negotiate with the Branch Davidians, and some of the things that they started doing, particularly over the next couple of weeks, really upset me. And so I was a member of the executive council of the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. You guys know what that organization is, but it's a professional society of about 3,000 social scientists of religion. And so the executive council drafted a letter, and we sent that letter to the Attorney General Reno, asking if we could assist them and maybe act as third-party negotiators. We believed that we had some experts who could step in and maybe help them. And they just pushed us away and said, no, we have our own experts, thank you very much.
Really?
Yeah. So, and when that ended badly, and they said, they held it up, you know, threw up their hands and said, there's nothing we can do about it, I knew better. And that was actually the incentive for the book, because I pulled together scholars I thought could have helped them, and this thing could have turned out very differently.
Well, part of the problem, too, I think, is that experts that they may have consulted could have used a different method than maybe you would have used or we would have used, because people come at things from different perspectives. Since our studies are in religious studies, we're acquainted with different methods of how to understand a group and how to interpret its beliefs. It might be really interesting if we could just discuss the different ways that you as a scholar use to interpret a group, to understand it. And then if you could relate that to how that could have helped resolve the crises peacefully, I think that would really be helpful.
Yeah, I think for me, since I work on early Christianity and Jesus, the first thing that came to my mind, and we'll talk about it throughout these sessions, but who's their leader and what do they think him to be? Because all sorts of things were getting thrown around. He thinks he's God, he thinks he's Christ. Some people even said he thought he was Jesus. And I had never heard of the Branch Davidians, so this is all new to me, but I'm kind of scrambling to try to figure out what is the worldview of the group? Who do they think their leader is? Where do they think they are in any kind of a apocalyptic scenario? That was really key. You and I talked about that in the first few days, because if we could figure out where they think they are, then they're trying to interpret the situation. They're inside looking out. The FBI's outside looking at them as a hostage barricade situation, as they called it. I think Stuart's going to tell us more about that because there's a previous history. So my method really was to try to translate their worldview, to put myself inside with them and think, how are they thinking? Which is basically what negotiators do. And I think the FBI has that intention, But if they're not trained, if they begin talking about, well, this guy is just spewing forth Bible babble, and he's talking about the 7 seals, and the joke was that they thought they were animals at first, like seals, you know, in the ocean.
7 seals.
And I think we saw that that's really not a joke. I mean, they quickly learned that it was something more, but still, I don't fault them in the sense that when you come to a hostage barricade situation, you don't bring your Bible normally. But with Koresh, with David Koresh, that would be the main thing you would bring to try to, because he wanted to talk about his faith. I think he wanted to convert them, didn't he? All of those hours on the phone. So my method was just to try to get inside the way their thought world, and we can talk as we go on about how you and I did that, but we did it together actually.
Yeah.
So.
To find them in Scripture where they thought they were in the prophetic scenarios. And Dr. Wessinger, what was your approach to this?
Well, I'm trained in the history of religions, the study of the history of religions, or otherwise known as religious studies. And again, there's an emphasis on understanding what people believe, their worldview, and you can learn about that from multiple sources, from things they say, things that might be written, things that might be recorded on audio tape or videotape. And the idea is to really understand how they perceive the world. And that requires a degree of empathy. But just because you're entering into their thought world and then you try to write about it accurately or speak about it accurately, that does not necessarily mean that you adopt their worldview. Usually you don't adopt their particular worldview. Right. But you could also study a religion that you yourself are participating in, as long as you do it critically. You know, take a step back and then look at it critically. So that's the way I was trained. But also, about that time, I was meeting sociologists. I was attending the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. I've learned a lot from sociologists through the years. And so I've been applying their methodologies and also in my written work. And I think an important thing to note about the Branch Davidian case is that it wasn't all about their theology. Their theology was important, their worldview was important, but the interactions of people in society, the news media, the federal law enforcement agents, the way they interacted with them was crucial for the 2 different outcomes on February 28th and then also on April 19th. So it's an interdisciplinary approach, ultimately.
Yeah. So I'm a sociologist by training, and studying new religious movements presents kind of a special challenge. Oftentimes they don't want to be studied and observed, and
like they're under some microscope or something.
Yeah, exactly. There's a certain challenge to gaining access, trying to win them over, gain some trust, and because it really does require some embeddedness in the group, so you can make those observations, you can observe the group's beliefs and practices and rituals. Sometimes what they say they do, they don't actually do in practice, and there may be discrepancies between beliefs and practices. But it helps to gain their trust and be on the inside. And again, what Kathy was talking about, trying to develop this empathetic understanding so that you see the world as they see it. We have a term for that. Max Weber, the famous German sociologist, called it Verstehen, but it sort of translates as empathetic understanding. But definitely to see the world as they see it in their own meaning systems. And then beyond that, I would say you want to look at primary materials, any books, magazines, pamphlets, any social media that they have, recordings of lectures or sermons or what have you, and then any kind of secondary materials. You definitely want to do a literature search, see if anybody else has studied or published on their findings on this particular group. Oftentimes that's not the case.
Well, what happened that first day then with the raid? The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms shows up. For my studies, they show up in what you could call cattle cars, I think they're called, and they jumped out of the vehicle and they run toward the house. Maybe they have a warrant, but it looks to the Branch Davidians inside that you have some armed, uniformed
This is like a SWAT team.
them.
People fully equipped that we see all the time.
This is on Sunday morning.
In anti-terrorism raids.
They're having Bible study, and the Bible study's interrupted, and so the SWAT team is rushing them. Why did the ATF choose that particular day to do it, and why were they doing it in the first place?
Yeah, can we back up a little bit here? I think the question is, was the raid necessary? Yeah. And according to my research and the research of other scholars, and even the congressional report, the ATF had multiple opportunities to arrest Koresh outside Mount Carmel property to not endanger all the other 125 or however many people were in there, including small children, infants, and they didn't seize that opportunity. My interviews with David Thibodeau, who's one of the survivors, and he said that he and David Koresh, when there was a surveillance operation that set up across the street, right, on from Double E Ranch Road.
So these are BATF agents living
undercover agents.
I remember going there. You can see that house from.
Yeah, that was a two-month surveillance operation in which they had multiple opportunities to arrest Koresh. The raid was not necessary. They didn't do it. My interview with David Thibodeau, he said that he and David Koresh went across the street one day to welcome their new neighbors with 2 boxes of pizzas and knocked on the front door. And the guy answered the door and didn't want to talk to him, just grabbed the pizza and said thanks and shut the door. So they could have arrested him right there. Right.
Well, the impression that was given, I can remember, were that they were sort of a group of Texas gun owners or rednecks with their guns. But from what I've heard from all of you in our discussions, is that they were actually an international community. Right? Isn't that right? There were people from the Caribbean, from Israel. Where else?
Lot from the UK.
UK, yeah.
And all over the United States. There were a few Texans. Of course, David Koresh was a Texan. But.
Right. Well, just because they showed up with weapons doesn't mean that they necessarily shot first. So how did this interchange of gunfire take place, in which, as I understand it, 4 ATF agents lost their lives? And what was it? 6 Branch Davidians lost their lives. So why was there a gunfight at the OK Corral?
I mean, we've interviewed, I think all of us actually have interviewed the survivors, and their story is very consistent.
What is that story?
And that's the story that David Koresh saw you can see the cattle car trailers coming from a distance, whipping up the dust. And they're driving fast, 60 miles an hour down the driveway. It's a long driveway on a farm road. And he tells everybody, calm down, goes to the front door. It's a double door. And he says, wait, don't shoot. There's women and children here. And then it's confusing because somebody shot the dogs. Right out front, there were some dogs in a pen with a mother with some puppies. I doubt, certainly the Branch Davidians didn't shoot the dogs, but just that gunfire. But I remember Dick DeGuerin telling us, he's the lawyer, we'll talk about him later, who went in there and saw firsthand, very rational judge of evidence as a lawyer, very famous lawyer in Texas.
And Jack Zimmerman was with him.
Was with him. And
former
David showed
Marine lawyer.
them the metal doors, and the bullets are incoming, not outgoing. In fact, he said he didn't see a single outgoing, meaning they're not shooting through.
I have something to contribute here. In 2000, the families and survivors of the Branch Davidians filed a wrongful death suit against the government, right? So the government was on the defense in this case. But I was sitting in the courtroom when an ATF agent was called to the stand, And he told the jury that day that the first shots were fired were from the dog team, who assignment was to get, they were first ones out of the cattle cars, and they were to shoot the dogs because they were afraid the dogs might bite or be some kind of a danger or threat to the ATF agents. So the first shots fired were by ATF's dog team. Now, did the Branch Davidians think that they were getting fired at? In that confusion, that's certainly a possibility, and that's kind of my theory, has been my theory over the years.
Well, I know that David says in one of the tapes, one of the negotiation tapes that the FBI has released, he says...
this is on the phone he's talking.
Yeah, he's on the phone talking to the FBI. He says, I went to the door, opened the door, and I said, stop, wait, there are women and children in here.
Don't shoot.
Don't shoot. Then he says, about that moment, an 8mm round went off, went by my ear, hit the door, and I slammed the door.
He was shot right then.
And then a little later, in another conversation with a different FBI negotiator, he asked that negotiator, he says, you know, you don't believe that we were defending ourselves. You go look at the videotape that the ATF made the day I opened the door, and you will see who fired first. You'll see the whole thing. And the agent says, well, I don't know anything about a videotape. And David Koresh says, I saw the cameras across the road where you were recording it. Just go look, ask your superiors to let you see the tape. So now, after this was all over with, and the 86 people are dead, there were congressional investigations. And of course, people wanted to view the tape that was recorded that day. And what were we told? We were told that the cameras malfunctioned that day. Yeah, we had cameras, but none of them worked that day.
Mm-hmm. I remember that.
And then the door would have been good evidence.
And
this is a metal door after the fire. It would survive.
And it disappeared?
The door is also gone.
Because there were more shots going into the building on the right-hand side of the door, and some shots coming out, more or less on the left-hand side of the door, as you're looking at the building. And during the fire, and this is on, network video, a combat engineering vehicle, which is just a tank that is disarmed, it went up and grabbed the doors and pulled them off. But the right-hand door is missing. It was never produced during the congressional hearings or the trials, and only the left-hand door was visible. David Koresh also, there, as you mentioned, let's see, a total of 5 people died. There were several, during the shootout, there were several wounded.
Branch Davidians wounded.
Several Branch Davidians. Actually, 4 ATF agents were killed. 5 Branch Davidians were killed during the shootout. David Koresh was wounded in the side. I believe Clive Doyle, a survivor, says that he received the wound to the side when he went up to the top of that central tower. And, but then later that afternoon, a young Branch Davidian by the name of Michael Schroeder, he was working at a car repair shop down the road, and his family was there at Mount Carmel. So he started walking back across the fields behind the building, and the ATF agents stationed back there said that he shot at them, but nevertheless, whatever happened back there, Michael Schroeder was shot and killed, and his body was left to lay there for a few days before it was collected or the scene was investigated, and I think it rained in the meantime. So the death of Michael Schroeder was never adequately investigated because with the fire, that was such a tremendous tragedy. I think the death of Michael Schroeder was just shoved aside.
Let me ask you all this, and even people listening to this who might not have witnessed this, but it's on YouTube footage and so forth. What I've always noticed, the day of the raid I noticed this because they kept playing the clip over and over, and it's the scene of the front. Everybody's seen it that's followed Waco.
From the TV reporters.
TV reporters. And there's dozens of ATF agents behind the cars and trucks that are parked in front. There's about 6 or 8 cars parked in front of the building. and they're just firing like this. You know, you see them pulling, just pop, 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 pop. You can hear the gunfire. And the windshields on those cars and trucks that they're crouched behind for cover, not a single one broken. And it's just, I noticed that the very first day. Now, I'm not, obviously 4 ATF agents were shot, others were wounded. I think most of that happened around the building up on the roof when some of them tried to enter, and there were some fatalities. A couple of them were on camera. But the report we got you and I were in the congressional hearings testifying, was that we received so much return fire from the building that I remember one of them said it was like worse than Vietnam. And I just thought, wait a minute, you're behind the cars, not a single windshield is broken, and you can see the curtains. Every window had curtains.
Yeah.
The curtains are closed, nothing's moving behind the curtains. Now, there might have been one person on that second floor firing, I can't say for sure. But in general, the way you hear it is there's all these people in the top with their guns firing at the agents, and then the agents firing. And didn't you quoted some source saying we were getting 50 caliber machine gun bullets?
in the
These are
at the hearings, maybe
Yeah.
not the day you guys testified. I testified the first day and then stayed for a couple more days. But ATF agent Jim Cavanaugh said in his testimony that they were outgunned, and that it was like the ATF had pop guns and the Branch Davidians had 50 caliber guns and machine guns. I'm not buying that. I never bought that. I don't think they were outgunned at all. But your point is well taken. And another thing we might mention here is that video also shows that the ATF agents are shooting blindly into that building.
Into a frame building with
into that
women and
building,
children
not knowing
inside.
who's behind those walls. I think that's illegal because you don't know who you're shooting at. And there were infants and children and women in there on the floor trying to protect themselves.
Well, another time too, Jim Cavanaugh, the ATF person that you referred to, he's on the phone with David shortly after the raid of 28. And Steve and David tell him that the helicopters fired. And immediately there's denial on the part of the ATF that the helicopters fired. And David comes to the phone himself, and he absolutely insists that there was fire
He gets very angry
from the
starts
helicopters.
yelling. Yeah.
And finally, Jim Cavanaugh turns to others in the room, and he comes back and he says, well, what I'm saying is there was no automatic fire from the helicopters. And David says, whether it was automatic or not, you fired through our ceiling. So why did they pick that Sunday morning to do their raid?
So in the run-up to the raid, which by the way was a no-knock dynamic entry, an attempted dynamic entry into the building by the ATF agents. But at any rate, before the ATF raid occurred, the Waco Tribune-Herald had been researching a series that they were going to publish on David Koresh and the lifestyle out at the Branch Davidians' property known as Mount Carmel. And they titled this the Sinful Messiah series. And while the ATF commanders were planning the raid, they went to the Tribune-Herald editors and asked that they hold the story because they did not want to, in their words, increase the defensive posture of the Branch Davidians at Mount Carmel. But the editors at the Waco Tribune-Herald wanted to get their story out before the ATF raid. The ATF commanders wanted to carry out the raid before the story came out. So the reporters with the Tribune-Herald heard that the raid was going to take place probably on February 28th, they heard that the raid was going to take place soon. So the first installment of the Sinful Messiah series was published on Saturday, February 27th. So then the commanders of this ATF team decided to hurry up and go ahead and carry out the raid the next day. So that's why they carried out on February 28th. The ATF had trained for this raid. They had gotten special forces training at Fort Hood. They were really hoping to make a big news splash, apparently, for budget reasons in Washington, D.C. But so they went ahead and carried out the raid. And then the next day, the Tribune Herald, after the raid, this is the day after the raid, they published the remaining stories in the series.
So where were they getting their information about the Branch Davidians to write this article?
From former members.
Former members?
Former members who, I think the former members were concerned about David Koresh having sex with underage girls. That was a main concern. That was a main concern of the editors at the Tribune Herald and the reporters. But they did call David Koresh. I don't think the reporters went out and interviewed Koresh in person because they knew that an ATF raid was impending. So they also knew that the Branch Davidians had weapons. So they chose not to interview him out at Mount Carmel, but they did interview David Koresh by phone.
Now, didn't Child Protective Services already visit there?
Well, that was in '92. So the same former members, many of whom were then living in Australia, they alerted authorities, they alerted Child Protective Services. There had been a custody battle earlier. And so a social worker with Child Protective Services went out to Mount Carmel, talked to the children, talked to David Koresh. He explained his apocalyptic theology to her.
I bet she enjoyed that.
Well, she knew a lot about it. She knew that they were expecting to die in a fiery explosion. So she knew that, and she told that to the FBI agents later. But back to the investigation about the children, she found no evidence at that time of any sort of child abuse, either physical abuse, through spankings. There were spankings, but she concluded that the spankings were not abusing the children, and she couldn't find evidence of the child sexual abuse that was going on. So at that time, she closed the case for lack of evidence.
I see. So then David Koresh is there with his church community. We found that it has a long history going back over 150 years, and they're now faced with this media frenzy, plus the FBI holding daily press conferences where David Koresh is reduced to a maniacal figure who's spouting out constant Bible babble. But from the point of view of the Branch Davidians and David himself, did he have a message? Did he have an interpretation of the Bible that had significance and meaning to him and the community? If so, what was that? What really did they believe?
Well, this relates back to the history of the Davidians and the Branch Davidians, because they were splinter groups from the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And the Seventh-day Adventist Church has a prophet. That's Ellen Harmon White. Now, the Seventh-day Adventist Church only has one prophet, okay? But they believe that she was inspired to cast new light on the Bible, specifically prophecies about the coming last days. In the 1930s, a man named Victor Hotef, he started interpreting the Bible, and he gained some followers who thought that he was a prophet, divinely inspired to interpret the Bible's prophecies. So he founded a group that we can call the Davidians. They were the General Association of the Davidian Seventh-day Adventists. They came to Waco and they bought property, and they arrived in Waco in 1935. And this property was called Mount Carmel, and it was next to the lake, Lake Waco. Then he died in 1955. Hotef died in 1955. So his wife, Florence Hotef, became the leader. And she made a prediction based on his teachings that during Passover, 1959, there would be an apocalyptic event. It's a very complex prophecy, so we don't have to get into the nature of that prophecy. But one thing she did, she sold the old Mount Carmel property, and she bought many acres northeast of Waco, 10 miles outside of town, and that became known as New Mount Carmel. So when her prediction failed, and Davidians from all over the world came to Mount Carmel for what they expected to happen miraculously. So when the prophecy failed, she said she was mistaken. She dismantled the organization, the trustees, in other words, and they sold most of the land, and that left a little bit more than 77 acres. And that became what we know as Mount Carmel today. In the meantime, in the 1950s, a man by the name of Ben Roden, and he was a follower of Hotef, but he didn't agree with Florence's interpretations. So he started to hold himself out as a prophet who was inspired to interpret the Bible's prophecies. And he ended up organizing another splinter group that we can call the Branch Davidians. And basically their official name was the General Association of the Branch Davidian Seventh-day Adventists, founded around 1955. In the 1960s, he tried to buy the new Mount Carmel property, but you still had some older Davidians hanging around. You know, they had paid tithes to pay for that property. So it took a while for him to buy them out. The sale was completed in 1973. And so then what remained of Mount Carmel belonged to the Branch Davidians. When he died, and I think that was in 1977, then his wife, Lois Roden, she became the next prophet. And she introduced the teaching that the Holy Spirit is feminine. This was a new teaching for the Branch Davidian. But they regarded her as a prophet who was divinely inspired to interpret the Bible's prophecies about the last days. In 1981, a young man came to Mount Carmel named Vernon Howell, and she began grooming him as her successor because she was in her 70s. And he later changed his name to David Koresh. In 1991, he changed his name. But what happened is that the Branch Davidians living there, the majority of them, they came to decide that Lois Roden had lost the spirit of prophecy. And the spirit of prophecy had moved to this young man. And then it gets very complex because Lois Roden's son was there, George, and he was violent, and they had to leave Mount Carmel for a while. But ultimately, most of the Branch Davidians followed this young man, and they lived at a camp outside Palestine, Texas for a while, and they were able to move back onto the property in 1988. So there's a distinction between the Davidians, who are the followers of Victor Hotef, and then later Florence Hotef, and then the Branch Davidians that started with Ben Roden and continued through David Koresh.
And I think what this shows, it's so important, is David didn't just pop up one day and decide, I'm a crazy cult leader. There's this continuity for over 150 years of a movement that has a living prophet with different branches, and he is the one that we know because of the media and because of the tragedy at Waco. But he himself has these roots as well, growing up in the Adventist church and getting interested in this.
So you're dealing with people who are intelligent, who are capable. All of them seem to be very interested in trying to understand the Bible. So that doesn't strike you as someone who's brainwashed. In fact, it looks like these people are just consumed with the idea that God has spoken through a sacred text. And if we can interpret that text correctly, we can restore truth that's been lost by conventional Judaism and Christianity. They're trying to get back to the sources. We may disagree with their interpretations. Maybe they're using an amateur methodology because they haven't been trained correctly in languages or culture.
According to scholars.
Yeah, their attempt is to, from my research of the Branch Davidians, they're the type of person who really wants to figure out the meanings of biblical passages and put them together in a meaningful way. Is that what you found?
They're also restorationists. That is, they have a whole narrative. This goes back to the Seventh-day Adventists, again, the parent organization that Martin Luther began to reform and made certain steps, and John Wesley and Knox and Alexander Campbell. These are like steps. And then Ellen G. White came along, and you've got to talk about what she restored. The big thing was the seventh-day Sabbath, that the church went to Sunday, which they see as a pagan, Babylonian kind of a holy day.
Day of the sun.
And Jesus and the early Christians kept the seventh day. They were Jews. And so she restored that. And then for Koresh, after that, Hatef comes along. He breaks from that church, and he says, but there's also the kingdom of God on earth. Passages like Isaiah 2 that pictures this millennial period on earth. We need to teach that, so we're going to restore that. And then the Rodins come along, and they restore the feast days, Passover, Pentecost. This came up a lot during the siege, because who's heard of these things if you're not Jewish? You don't know the details. So it sounds almost like they're a Judeo-Christian group, but they would see it as, no, we're not a Judeo-Christian group. They're not. They had one Jew, I think, that was Pablo Cohen, an Israeli. So they're not Jewish as we would normally call them Jews, but they would essentially say, we're going back to restore the original truths of Jesus Christ. So to them, they're actually going to authentic original Christianity. They're convinced of that. If you remember, what David finally claimed really trumps any of those former prophets, because he was willing to admit that Ellen G. White was a prophetess, Ben Roden and Lois, and Victor Hodoff before that. But he said that he was the seventh, it's translated angel in the Bible, but it means messenger, that there would be 7 messengers, and he was the 7th. So he opened the book of Revelation, chapter 10, and he actually found himself mentioned in chapter 10 of Revelation and other places as the 7th final and the final messenger. And you ask, like, what would cause these people to be so wedded to him and want to stay no matter what? Because he convinced them that he was that messenger. Now, how did he do it? He didn't work any miracles. He wasn't really an amazingly charismatic speaker like you picture a television evangelist with thousands of people. He would just sit with people and say, well, let's look at the text, let's study the Bible. What does it say about this 7th messenger? That he will know all the mysteries of the prophets, and it'll be in the last days and so forth. So what David said basically was, I will take you through the entire Bible, but particularly the prophets. This is like Isaiah, Micah, Habakkuk, Nahum, Zephaniah. He had all of these memorized. And I think Adventists, most of the members came from Adventist backgrounds, not all of them, but wherever they came from, they knew a little about these things. But how many people have read Habakkuk lately? How many people could just quote Zephaniah or Zechariah?
Or the Psalms even.
Or the Psalms, or the book of Revelation, or the book of Daniel. Now, David said he had a vision in Israel in 1985 where he ate the book. That's kind of a weird imagery.
Which book is this that he ate?
We think he says in one of his sermons that it's the book of Daniel. But that book contains all references to all the others. So what he did is he pulled together everything else. So it wouldn't be like you ate the whole Bible. Now, what is this eating the Bible? It's actually from the book of Ezekiel. It means to totally absorb your message so that you literally eat it. And he said it's bitter in your belly, but also sweet in your mouth. And so David would say, I've got a bitter message, but it's also a sweet message because it's going to save the world. So these people have studied with him hours upon hours. And when Phil and I got interested in trying to help, we spent hours, we got hold of tapes of David teaching his followers to kind of tutor ourselves. And I'll have to say, I mean, I have a PhD in biblical studies, and I'm not a Davidian, and I don't think David Koresh was a Messiah, anything like that. But I got a glimpse of what he was able to do with those texts. I remember listening once for several hours. He went from Isaiah 40 through 66. And those are texts I know pretty well. I deal with them. Jesus quotes them a lot. They're in my work. And I will have to say, he had pulled out of those things images and associations that I could see how some I had never really thought of. And this is the way he was. And he would, I'll give you a real easy example. He would say things like, turn to Psalm 40. Psalm 40, you probably haven't read it lately. It's about the Messiah. Messiah doesn't mean Jesus Christ. It means the chosen one, the anointed one. And he starts reading it. And it is about somebody. It says this person speaks, I listen to God. I hear God. Morning by morning, he wakens my ear. I hear his voice. But then it goes on to say, my sins are more than the hairs of my head. And David would say, and it was very dramatic. On the tapes, he would do something like this. So, if that's me, and I'm the Messiah, I'm a sinful Messiah. Some of you think it's Jesus, but wasn't Jesus without sin, according to and remember, the Davidians are Christians. They believe in Jesus Christ. They think he's the Son of God. They think he's the Messiah. But they believe there'll be a latter-day Messiah, a sinful Messiah. We're talking about all these interpretations of David Koresh and who he thought he was and the figure and so forth. And we've touched on this a bit, but he also had practices that were embedded in that theology, but they sound pretty shocking to people. He marries Rachel, that's fine. He has his wife.
She was 14, which was legal with parental permission.
So I know you've worked a lot on this with the, to the members, and what's going on there, and how does he justify it?
Well, he began to take additional wives, obviously not legal wives, but these were young women that he married in the group, quote, married, and he began in 1986. Now, the first, and he did this, especially when they were young, say 14 and younger. He was aiming to have 24 children for a particular purpose. So what's the origin of this idea that he was supposed to have 24 children?
This figure in the Psalms, Psalm 45, has many wives and children. So if he's the figure, he's got to have many wives and children. I would say a prophet and more than a prophet, because since you're the seventh, you're the last. And the text says, whoever that seventh messenger is, to him will be made known all the mysteries of the prophets. So this is the final revelator. Jesus would have been the preliminary revelator that brought the truth for his day. But they quoted Jesus. He said, I have a lot of other things that I could tell you, but it's not time for that. So the Davidians picked up on that and said, well, at the end time, this will come out. So they thought he was a Messiah, a Christ, but not Jesus.
Yeah, I think that David identified several titles of this figure in the last day that would come. Yes. You'd have the seventh messenger. Also, you would have the Lamb.
The Lamb.
The Lamb would be the one that could interpret all these mysteries according to the prophets. Yes. Began to see himself as the Lamb. Now, Jesus in traditional Christianity is considered to be the Lamb. But in this case, David thinks there's a Lamb that comes at the very end time in the book of Revelation and would be identified with that seventh messenger. But he also found other titles that he would fulfill. I think he began to see, for some reason, he began to view that there are many labels, figures, and names in the Bible, but they all point to one composite figure in the end time. And I think in Isaiah 45, it says there will come a Gentile Messiah. Isaiah 45:1. Yeah, it says that my anointed, my Mashiach, Cyrus, Koresh, will come, and he will save Israel.
And Cyrus is the name of a Persian king who destroys Babylon. Right. Now they're taking it spiritually, not literally. There was a king named Cyrus who destroyed Babylon. But Babylon in the book of Revelation is not ancient Babylon. It's the whole system of the world. So there needs to be a new Koresh or Cyrus, a Davidian, you see. So that's where he got the name.
A King David figure. That's
yeah.
why he changes his name to David, too, to represent this end-time Davidic Mashiach that would come. Now, don't you find it fascinating how he's able to go from Isaiah 45 with the figure Koresh or Cyrus and keep focused on that one figure through chapter 46, 47, 48, 49, and identifies that same figure up into Isaiah 53, 52, 53, 54, and there where we have the suffering servant that comes. Yes. It's the same figure, he says. Yes. Now, I've studied these things for 40 or 50 years. It never occurred to me that the writer of Isaiah, Deutero-Isaiah, is writing, and he has in mind one figure to close out the book. I always figured that there were 3 or 4 figures he's referring to. One would be Cyrus himself, but then you get to around 53, there's a suffering servant that could be all of Israel, could be a plurality of the people, the remnant people, or it could be a Mashiach that is going to suffer, and Christians have generally said that's Jesus. But I never thought that maybe that all those passages, Isaiah is referring to one figure. So when I heard David say that on one of the tapes, I thought, that's a creative idea. I don't know if it's true. Never thought about it. And doesn't he make a point in Isaiah 53? It says that whomever that figure is, he will see his seed. Yes. Jesus had no children. So there's something remaining to be done that figure must do that produces children. And David Koresh said, yes, I will produce messianic children because I am that figure. And he ties it into what? Psalm? Is it Psalm 45 also?
Yeah.
Isaiah 45, Psalm
about
45.
About the children and the many wives. And
yeah, there's a figure, Psalm 45 says that will come a Messiah figure.
Right.
That will ride on a horse, and he identifies that with...
So I think the point is not whether any of us believe this or really whether anybody believes it, but the group inside, this is what has drawn them together, and they become convinced that he is this person. And the one thing they mention constantly to the FBI, to their puzzlement, is he can open the 7 seals. You always hear that. And this is the idea of a scroll, a rolled up scroll. It's got 7 wax seals. And as you open each seal, something gets revealed. And the whole structure of the book of Revelation is around these seals, and yet they're called the mystery of the 7 seals, or the 7 thunders, as they're also called. And this figure is supposed to hear the mystery of the 7. There's a thunder each time one is open. But then he's told, don't reveal it except, to the chosen ones and so forth. So they're convinced, and why would they come out when they've been attacked? They're with the Messiah that has these mysteries and this ability. From their point of view, you've got to find a way to appeal to them within their worldview. And that's what we began to try to do, you and I did.
So in the book of Revelation, you have a figure seated on a throne, a heavenly figure. In his right hand, he holds that book or scroll sealed with the 7 seals. And it states that the only person who can open those seals is the Lamb. And because David could persuasively interpret the meaning of each of the seals in the point of view of his followers, then they concluded that he was the Lamb, and that meant he was Christ. Not Jesus Christ, but a Christ for the last days. And so the Branch Davidians believe that God has sent a manifestation from time to time. They're figures mentioned in the Bible. They mention Melchizedek, who Abraham knew. They mention the young man named Elihu in the book of Job. And so they believe that these and probably others were earlier manifestations of the Christ Spirit. Yahshua, Jesus, had the Christ Spirit. But David Koresh also has the Christ Spirit, and he's the Christ for the last days. So they believe there's a Father. They believe there's a Mother. That's the Holy Spirit. The Father and the Mother have a Son. That's Christ, who is God manifested from time to time here on earth in the flesh. And in the last days, the Son will have a wife, and there will be a marriage in heaven. And that's part of their scenario for salvation in the last days.
Mm-hmm. This wife is the spiritual community.
Well, I learned this from Clive Doyle, a survivor, and what he told me is that different Branch Davidians have different opinions on who the wife might be. Some of David Koresh's earthly wives, they thought maybe she would be the one.
Oh, okay.
It's Clive's opinion that no, and he said that David actually told them that no, they wouldn't be his wife in relation to the marriage that's going to take place in heaven. So this gets back to their understanding of salvation. You know, those who are going to be included in the kingdom will have a perfect mate that comes from within. And so it's Clive's opinion that that perfect mate for the Son comes from within him. But he admits that that's his interpretation.
I think that shows how complex it is. And again, back to the main point, is if you're going to deal with such a community, the first thing you've got to do is recognize that complexity, and also how the group internally is having 7 and 8 hour Bible studies almost daily on these sorts of things. And you can't just barge in and begin demanding things.
A little later in the book, it says that these things can be understood by the prophets. So David goes back to the prophets, as you said, and he finds those elements that are mentioned in the seals in the Hebrew Bible, and therefore he relates these hundreds of scriptures to each one of the seals. So it fleshes out that outline. What I was going to mention would be that as he's doing this, people are listening, they're studying, they're trying to understand what he's saying, and he shows us a prophetic outline that will lead to certain things in the future. He thinks either in Jerusalem or maybe in Waco. But over and over again, he says these things are not inevitable. There's a prophetic scenario that can end in disaster because the Christ that came the first time was crucified. Well, he thinks the lamb that comes at the end could very well be crucified again, could die again. He says Moses struck the rock twice, not just once. And the rock is the Christ that was struck once, but will be struck again. But then he says, look at Nineveh. Jonah prophesied that Nineveh would be destroyed, but Nineveh was not destroyed. God spared the city, and Jonah got disgusted at that fact. So prophecies don't have to end in the way they're prophesied of destruction. They could end in a different way. So I think David is saying, even though the seals lead to destruction by the time we get to seals 6 and 7, it doesn't have to happen at our time now. And what surprised me about it was it's not an interpretation of the seals as if they are a political, geographical kind of statement of end-time prophecy like maybe Hal Lindsey would do. You know, it's not Magog is going to attack Israel and Edom is going to do this or that. That's kind of what I was expecting, a more geopolitical prophetic interpretation. Instead, it's actually more of a sensitive reading of the first seal that's connecting to Bible prophecies in the Old Testament, where you get the impression that if you read this correctly, you'll gain a deeper understanding of the Christ. So it's more personal and reflective, and that surprised me.
All of our souls looking for our mate or for God or for union. So that's what you mean by deeper.
It's Genesis, maybe we're divided, male and female. We're trying to get back together as one.
Exactly.
You got to do that through the revelation of the Christ.
Mystical, you'd call it. Yeah, mystical.
So since we don't have it, you know, from just a scholar's point of view, it's as if a book was going to be produced by a charismatic prophetic figure who had a mystical inclination that we don't have. So the culture's been robbed of that. It would have been another Book of Mormon, another, shall I say, Quran. It would have been another revelation of some sort. So I'm intrigued and curious as to what else he would have produced over the next 6 seals. And we'll never know. Why don't we know? Because on Monday the 19th, early that morning, what began to happen? Well, David Koresh says that having the ATF come in would be like the little brother coming in and beating up on you. And then the big brother comes in and beats up on you even more. So the FBI takes over from the ATF. And now we go into the long 51-day standoff. The FBI did a lot of things during that time. They had daily press conferences. They had negotiations going on with Branch Davidians, many hours every day. And I thought we could spend some time just discussing that, things they did right, things they did wrong. I hope you get some feedback on that.
There was more than one FBI team there. You had the hostage rescue team. They're the tactical operators, their SWAT team. You had a team of negotiators, or you had FBI negotiation coordinators. Some of their negotiators were FBI agents. Some were police officers from Austin. And one FBI agent from Austin was Byron Sage. And then the special agent in charge, Jeffrey Jamar, he had a bureaucratic role above being a special agent in charge of an office. And so he was brought in to be the on-site commander. And an important thing is that everything they did on the ground in Waco, they were reporting to a command center in the Hoover Building in Washington, D.C. It's called the SIOC, Strategic Information Operating Center.
It's hard to do 51 days, but I think if we go back to March 1st, right after the siege, something really critical happened that was talked about then the whole 51 days, and that is that David Koresh agreed to actually come out and surrender and give himself up so it would have been over after 2 days, I guess, if they would broadcast a sermon, a teaching, hesitate to call it a sermon, but a exposition of his message of the 7 seals. He did make a tape that lasted 58 minutes, about an hour. And after it was broadcast, I would say in a more limited way than he expected. If you look at the agreement, it's telephone calls back and forth. He wants something national that's going to go to the whole country, which is quite a bit to expect, but that was what he wanted, get his message out to the world. And it was actually played on a fairly limited Christian radio network, but it did get transcribed and printed, And newspapers, such as the Dallas Morning News and the Waco paper and other papers, picked up on it. But then after it was broadcast, David said, I've got a message from God that I'm supposed to wait. And what I really wanted to emphasize here is that set him up as being a liar. And we heard it then for 51 days. He's unreliable, he's a liar, he gives his word and then he breaks it.
These are the FBI agents saying that.
That's right. And anyone who would listen. You know, he's a cult leader, he lies, he manipulates. So let's talk about that. I've got things to say about the tape.
Well, he said that he had been told by God not to come out, but at that time, but he had been told to wait, and then he would be told to come out. So there was a promise of waiting with an end result of a time when he would exit with his people.
I don't know if he said that or not.
Well, it's a waiting period, and what are you waiting for? If you can't come out now, you're waiting for a time when you will come out.
I know
That'd be
Gary,
the logic of it.
Gary Nessner, the head negotiator, later said that he expected that, didn't surprise him at all. I think the negotiators weren't that surprised, but the tactical team definitely was disappointed and angry, and that anger contributed to a growing divide between the tactical team and the negotiators that played itself out in very dangerous ways and led to, I think, the kind of catastrophic ending that we saw.
But the negotiators do mention often over the period that follows, well, how do we know you're going to do that? Because before you said it and you lied. So they at least picked up on it, even if they expected it.
And Koresh defended himself saying, it wasn't that I lied, it was that God Almighty, he says, I have a commander in heaven. You FBI agents have a commander on earth, but I have a commander in heaven. If he gives me an order to wait, I have to obey it.
Gary Nessner, who was the negotiation coordinator, an FBI agent, from March 1 through March 24th, when he was taken off the case, as Stuart said, he was expecting, you know, some things to happen. They would make promises, they would break them, and he has articulated that his negotiation philosophy was, he called it trickle, flow, gush. You have get a few people out, then you get a few more people out, and then finally they all come out, or at least most of them. One reason I think David was motivated to make a deal for them to play that 58-minute sermon. Now, of course, he was wounded, you know, he was severely wounded, but he still recorded that. But on February 28th, even though he was wounded, he's calling CNN, he calls a Dallas radio station. But when the FBI agents got there, they cut off his telephone contact, and then they ran a telephone line that only went to the negotiators. Now, David's ultimate concern is to save souls. The judgment's coming. And so I think that was a big motivating factor for him to record that sermon. The log shows that when the Branch Davidian men started to carry David down the stairs on a stretcher, he was in a lot of pain, had no pain medication. And he said, let's wait and pray. And he prayed, and then he got that message, God says to wait.
I think for me that tape was a key because you and I, Phil, got hold of the transcript and read it, and it was being characterized almost universally as nonsense, incoherent Bible babble. Now, he is wounded, but still. So you could see maybe some of that was there because of his physical condition. But I remember talking to you on the phone. I was in Charlotte, North Carolina. You were in probably Houston when we were actually going over it. And we immediately recognized that it had been badly transcribed. And the best example I remember from that is there was a phrase in there, the liar of the trial of Judas. Now, I don't know anybody that could make sense. The liar of the, like Judas had it, Judas Iscariot? What are you talking about? It's crazy. It clearly was the Lion of the tribe of Judah. So you have somebody listening in typing, but they have no biblical understanding.
So Koresh has it right, and the transcriber gets it wrong.
You know, and that's just an example. I'm not saying every phrase was that way, but of course that would sound like babble. It's not even a coherent phrase that makes any sense. But beyond that, let's say we had a clear transcript, and we could figure a lot of that out. It actually was fairly systematic and held together. And that's what you and I first noticed, because we didn't know. Is he an unstable, almost mentally ill kind of guy that can't coherently even hold a thought together? And I think we decided from reading it, no, he actually has a system. We began to suspect that that's why the people were sticking with him, because he was an interpreter of Scripture. And that became completely confirmed. As time went on, we heard more tapes. We heard why the tapes came out from the Branch Davidians, interviews with them that the FBI later released, saying, why are we here? Why aren't we coming out? And it all fit together, that they were there for the reasons we've been discussing, that David had this sense of biblical interpretation. They were convinced that he was who he said he was. Well, that makes all the difference in the world then. And we had to come up with a strategy.
Once we got hold of that printed sermon, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, that was within a day or two of March 2nd. We looked at it, and I remember reading it and thinking, well, this sounds very similar to Seventh-day Adventist prophetic interpretation, going back over 125 years. And I thought, so David Koresh is very familiar with Adventist interpretation of prophecy. He's got seals, he's got the book of Daniel, he's got references to symbolic figures mentioned in the book of Revelation, the book of Daniel. And I remember thinking, yeah, he has a pattern that he's following. He believes these things are step-by-step fulfillments that could lead to tragedy, or it could lead to a resolution of the crises. And he believes we're in the end time. And that's when we began to take him seriously as an interpreter. And that's when we thought, well, if we can contact the FBI and explain to them that the community, the church community, is following an interpretation of Bible prophecy that they think makes sense and that we can interpret, that would be like giving the FBI secret intel to what the group may do next. And the FBI could use that intel to resolve the crises peacefully and to avoid making a mistake that could precipitate a terrible calamity.
So in this tape, the 58-minute tape, I believe David says, we're in the fifth seal now. What does that mean?
Yeah, that was chilling for us because we knew exactly what it meant. The fifth seal basically says that a small group of the believers have been killed, and then you're to wait until the rest are killed. Now that's a scenario for the very end times, and it's before the sixth seal. There's 7 altogether. The 7, it's all over. But the sixth seal, you get earthquakes and judgment, and all hell breaks loose, as we say, what people call the end of time. So you're right on the cusp of the end of time, with some killed and then waiting. So the waiting suddenly just jumps out at us, because in the sermon, the 58-minute, he hadn't said, I've got the word to wait yet. But that word is actually in the sixth seal, Revelation chapter 6. And so we thought, well, that's what he's thinking. And so is there any window or space of interpretation, or is it just inevitable? We wait till everybody's dead. And if so, then it was very bleak. But we began to study more details of his interpretation.
And we contacted the FBI. I can remember being on the telephone with agents, and I kept asking them, has he told you verbally which seal he thinks he's in? Well, that was hard for them to understand that question. What do you mean? Does he think he's in some seal? How do you get in a seal? Yeah. And I said, I can remember telling them, think of the 7 seals as 7 acts of a play. And let's assume we're in Act 1. That's okay. If he thinks he's in Act 1, that's not a very dangerous part of the drama, part of the play. The play begins to be very dangerous when you get around Seal 5. And Seal 6 is quite a calamity. So I need to know, Agent, if you could go find out from your superiors, which seal does he say he's on? And so finally the agent, I remember the agent says, okay, I'll do my best to find out. I said, when are you going to be back on duty, sir? This is very early March, I was talking to him. He says, I'll be here at 2 a.m. I said, I'll call you at 2 a.m. So I waited and I called him at 2 a.m. He said, I asked my superiors and they said that David Koresh has said he's in the 5th seal. So when I heard that, I knew that our time was short to try to salvage and save the situation, because the 5th seal, as Dr. Tabor has just said, says that some people have been killed. I began to realize that must be February 28th, when 6 of the Davidians were killed, and the rest of them will be killed later, assuming that the prophecies go along the destructive path and there's not a resolution made. So I knew then that we had to act, and we had to act quickly.
The bugs were placed in the building. Initially, the FBI would...
Hearing devices.
Listening
surveillance
devices.
I didn't want anybody to think they were palmetto bugs or
these
something.
yeah.
I'm just teasing.
This is the source from surveillance devices, or
Right.
the so-called bug tapes.
So they snuck those in with...
They snuck them in, but Graham Craddock, a survivor, says he found most of them, and then ultimately they just quarantined all the objects the FBI sent into one room. So there must have been some other way to insert these surveillance devices into the building. Of course, federal agents aren't telling us
Yeah,
what
they can
that was.
I'm sure they have ways of listening. Yeah.
But especially toward the end of the siege, especially when, well, after an argument that David had with a negotiator named Henry, this was on April 18th, the tanks were clearing out the
Right
vehicles.
before the fire.
They could see that an assault was pending, and David calls Henry and he says, what do you men really want? And so after that argument, then the surveillance devices pick up a number of conversations among Branch Davidians about fire, fulfillment of prophecy, and they were perfectly audible. I could hear them just using headphones. There's a memo written by Byron Sage. He says that there were 11 surveillance devices in the building. They had 11 FBI agents monitoring those surveillance devices. An Army colonel, Rodney Rawlings, in '99 said there were many more bugs inside the building. But in other words, these were audible conversations. And so the decision makers knew that they believed that a fire was coming to fulfill prophecies. So the question is, why would they...
Why deliver the very thing?
Why would you deliver this opportunity for suicide by cop? That's the big question I have. What do you think?
One answer would be that the FBI didn't know that. But you've given us evidence that Steve told them prophecies predicted such a thing, and that some of the people who were ex-members warned the FBI about it.
Even members.
And then you've got members, and then you've got bug tapes picking up conversations to the effect that there could be some kind of fire. They're praying it won't be, but it could be.
See, what the FBI has done is that after the fire, and you had 76 deaths in the building, in the fire, including 2 babies that were born in the fire, the FBI has produced transcripts of these bug tapes, the discussions of fire, saying, see, there was nothing we could do. They were going to set themselves on fire anyway. But that's ignoring the interactive context. The Branch Davidians were responding to what the FBI agents were doing.
The gas attack, yeah.
And the FBI agents, the commanders, including officials in SIOC, they had a choice not to carry out that tank and CS assault. The log shows that at around 1 a.m. on the morning of April 19th, one of the entries in the log indicates that the FBI had a pediatric burn specialist on standby at the Galveston Burn Clinic. And so, you know, a doctor down in Galveston knows they're going to launch an assault. I don't think so. But so the FBI would have had to have called this doctor and asked him to be on standby. So they knew that there would be casualties from burns. And one other point I want to make is that even if the Branch Davidians didn't have a theology about martyrdom and fire, just running tanks into a wooden building after they've inserted CS gas, there's a lot of kerosene in the building, there's a big propane tank directly behind the central tower. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that a fire was likely. So just looking at it, you know, excluding the theological component, they knew a fire was likely. And why would anyone think that that was a good idea to carry out that assault?
And if you go back to compound that, if you go back, okay, that the fire's on the 19th, go back to April 1st, 2 weeks earlier, let's talk a little bit about another factor that was at work, that there was actually an exit plan, a surrender plan, that did involve the theology and could have worked, and we'll explain it. But think about the juxtaposition here of knowing that was going on and yet not making use of it, and knowing that if you don't make use of it, everybody's going to be dead, and then you still behave that way. So, Phil, you initiated that. Why not? Let's talk about that, because that's the one thing in most of our documentaries I've watched for all these years now, decades. It gets mentioned occasionally, but I mean, this was really something involving the lawyers, and I don't think most people even are aware of this.
We were pretty discouraged by mid-March that the FBI was not going to incorporate worldview translators. Yeah. They're not going to listen to Bible experts trying to help them figure out when David Koresh might do this or that. We were all in the waiting period, waiting for it to end. And then toward the end of March, probably around the 25th or 26th of March, I got a phone call, a tip from one of the news agencies, CNN. And the reporter says to me, she says, I just wanted to call you and tell you, I know that the FBI is going to bring this to an end. They're going to go in on the Branch Davidians. That was a shock to me. I said, what are they going to do, use gas? And she just hangs up. That startled me, because I knew that if the FBI would try to use force, the religious group would not betray its principles. There's no way to get a religious person to deny their faith just because you're good to use force. But however you look at St. John, the same is true with other religious leaders. Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, he believes he must drink of that cup, even though he doesn't really want to. And when he's arrested, and when Judas and others want him to do something different, he has to pursue that which he's called to do. Knowing that, I had already tried the FBI. They were not willing to listen. So we thought, what could we do? We've got to talk to David Koresh directly. It's our last chance to save lives. So I called you on the telephone. We thought for a moment. I came up with the idea the only way to reach the Branch Davidians directly would be to go on the radio. Ron Engelman out of Dallas had a radio program that the Branch Davidians listened to every morning at 9 a.m. We called Ron on the phone, introduced ourselves, said, Ron, we've got a tip that the FBI is going to go in on the Branch Davidians soon. And we know lives are going to be lost because the Branch Davidians is a church community. They're not going to surrender, Ron. He said, I know you're right about that. And I said to him, could Dr. Tabor and I use your radio program to talk directly to the Branch Davidians? He said, what do you mean use my radio program? I said, well, could Dr. Tabor and I be on your program, and we would talk to David about the seven seals, show that we were interested, and maybe offer some alternative ways that he could interpret the seals without arguing with them, without conflicting with them. So I said, Ron, we need to get this message out to the Branch Davidians. And he said, yes, you can use our program to do that. And he said, in fact, I'll announce on the program every morning that you're going to be here next week, you and a scholar, James Tabor, and you'll be talking about the seven seals, and the Branch Davidians will hear that. And that way we know for sure they'll be listening. So we were very happy with that plan. And as far as we were concerned, we had given the FBI plenty of time to work through us. They didn't do it. And now we were going to do it ourselves and talk directly to the Branch Davidians, come hell or high water. And you and I worked on what we should say. And I know we took it very seriously. We spent several days working up a content. You recall that?
I do. And in fact, since I've got the Bible, I was just going to talk about the main thing. Really, it's pretty simple to explain, is back to Revelation 10, where David Koresh thought he was mentioned as his seventh angel. And what we built on was really two things. One is that wait a little while could be interpreted in a very elastic way. And we used examples in the Bible where in a little while this will happen. It doesn't necessarily mean a week, a month, a year. It can mean a whole period of time.
In the fifth seal.
In the fifth seal, yeah.
Wait a little season.
Wait a little season. So that was part of it, just to kind of stretch it out a little bit. But the other thing was we talked about how this message, it was really difficult. Let me try to explain that. We're talking to David, but we're talking to each other. So he's right here listening, okay? But we're not saying, David, you think this, that. Well, Phil. And he'd say, well, Jim. So I would say something, he would react, and David's, we hope, listening. So we would say things like, the Apostle Paul, he had to wait a while. In fact, he ended up in prison. And he wrote his greatest letters from prison. And that's when his message really went out to the Roman world. We call them the prison epistles. They're the highest expression of Paul's message. So there is a precedent. Let's say if David did come out and he's still waiting a little while, but how do you get out the message? And then we talked about you must prophesy again to many nations. That's what this figure is told.
Chapter 10, right?
Chapter 10 of Revelation. And the idea of writing a little book or a book. We just sort of threw that out. Maybe if Paul wrote his message, what if the message David thinks he has for the world is to go to the world, what if he wrote it out, or Steve could help him write it out? And then we would take it, this was kind of the bargain, to like the Society of Biblical Literature, American Religions. These are the whole world is focused on this, quote, crazy cult leader who supposedly has something to say. So we wanted to kind of not taunt him a little, but like, what would be the word? Intrigue him a little. Like, you got something to say? We don't know what it is. I mean, we are listening, but everybody else is saying, it's Bible babble, it's nonsense. And we said to each other, Phil, I didn't find it nonsense. I understood basically I don't know all he's saying. So that was kind of the appeal, to make more time. Also, I think you brought up that prophecies were not always inevitable, which we knew he agreed with.
Right, that's
They're
right.
conditional. I think mainly it was to show that we had intelligently listened, read the text, knew the text a bit ourselves, and if he really had something to say, offered to help mediate that to the wider audience.
And you also said not only in the Bible is there talk about a Koresh or Cyrus, but your studies, you brought up some things about the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah,
having a king, Cyrus.
That really, actually it had to do with the branch of David, is what I mentioned. There's a text, I didn't say David, you're mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I said, these things that David's studying are also the kinds of things that even the ancient Jews studied in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They talk about a branch of David coming and being wounded. No, I was close to the edge there because it's almost like, David, you're in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But actually, I think the idea was just that, I mean, I think he liked that idea that these deep truths of Scripture go back 2,000 years. You know, Jews were discussing who's the Messiah. Is he a suffering Messiah? Is he a powerful Messiah? You know, and David had studied all that himself.
Right. So he had heard of us as early as the middle of March. They was asking for Dr. Arnold, Dr. Tabor, and then here we appear again, talking directly to him. I'm looking at it from his point of view. It's like our names have surfaced. We not only were somewhat interested in the middle of March, but here we are, April 1, reaching out to the community. And I think this was right before Passover. Didn't Passover begin? A 7-day festival begins around the 6th of April.
April 5.
So he has a few days there to digest what we said.
And I remember saying to you on the phone, if you could just get to Dick DeGuerin because he's going in, maybe that would get things moving.
Oh yeah, I called you early that night. I'm in the Waco Hilton. So I'm on the pay phone in those days, talking to you and checking my messages from back in Houston.
Yeah, that bank of phones up on the wall, remember?
Bank of phones, coin operated. And so by the time I hang up, there's a woman on the telephone next to me, and she happens to drop her purse, and her credit cards fall out all over the floor of the Hilton. So I, being a Southern gentleman, I reached out, I pick up the credit cards, and I hand it to this very attractive young woman. And she said, I heard you on the telephone talking about Waco and the Branch Davidians. Are you up here on are you involved with that? And I said, well, yes, I study religion, and I am trying to interpret what he says about the 7 seals. She says, my husband would really like to talk to you. And I said, well, okay, well, who's your husband? She said, it's Dick DeGuerin. This is just a few minutes after hanging up from talking to you. And there was the avenue we needed. And she calls Dick, and he says, bring him right up. So I went right up to his room. It must be 11 p.m. I'm there till about 3 or 4 a.m. talking to Dick DeGuerin about the 7 seals and what the religious community believes.
And he'd just been in
and
thought he was finished.
Thought he was finished. Mm-hmm. And as it works out, he takes a copy of our radio program and decides to give it directly to David Koresh himself. And he knows for a fact that David took it and he and Steve listened to it. And
as I recall, you correct me, I believe Dick sat with, Thibodeau says they all sat around the table.
And listened.
And Dick played it on a cassette recorder. He didn't just drop it off.
Yes.
They all listened to it. So, everybody, the whole group gathered.
And they had heard it on the radio.
Yes.
But now
David was busy, I think.
And now they could focus in on it.
Right.
So that was what we believe as religion scholars was providential. And so the word got in there to David. And so then we enter Passover, the most sacred time of the year for the Branch Davidians. And it's a 7-day festival, not just a 1-day. And he says he will come out. He already said he would come out after Passover. So Passover ends around, that would be around the 12th.
13th.
13th.
Well, that was the last day.
Mm-hmm.
So on the 12th of April, David Koresh, as Passover is ending, he sends out the first of 3 letters. The first letter is a letter that is threatening. It's talking about what happens to people who disobey Yahweh, how the scriptures prophesy that they will be destroyed because they don't have the knowledge they need for salvation. On the 13th, he sends out a second letter. That letter gives the answer as to how not to be destroyed. That letter says, in my hand there is a book, and it's the 7 seals. If you learn the 7 seals, the prophecies in the first letter don't have to take place. The third letter comes out on the 14th of April, and that's a letter that he writes to his attorney, Dick DeGuerin. And in it, he says, he now has been given a super special revelation, a revelation that he is commissioned by Almighty God to write down for the first time in human history the meaning of the 7 seals. He says he's humbled to do this. He's never been allowed to do this, but now he's being allowed to do it. And as soon as he sees that the 7 seals are handed over to the attorney and that they are given to Jim Tabor and Phil Arnold, who will give them to other scholars, the community will come out. The waiting period is now over with. It's finished. As soon as he hands the letter to Dick DeGuerin and it's given to the Bible scholars, then the waiting period is over and the community will come out and the crisis will be resolved. Now, what did you think when you got that news?
That was a Wednesday. I was just ecstatically happy. And I thought it's solved. It's done.
You've done, yeah.
I was also anxious to read what he would write. And we know he did start writing, and I think we're going to talk about that in some detail because, again, the FBI story now, revisionist story, is that there's no evidence he was even writing or anything like that.
We have evidence that Ruth Riddle came out with a disc with his writings, which then became published and printed. It appears in your book.
Yeah, and we actually fulfilled our promise posthumously. We took it to the Society of Biblical Literature meeting in Washington, D.C. that fall. And I think some of you were there. We had a standing room only audience, American Academy of Religion, and we printed 500 copies, I think, and we handed it out saying, we promise we'd deliver.
Right. So he was writing. We have a copy of it. Ruth Riddle brought up a disc.
She brought it out of the fire. She escaped the fire.
She did.
One other thing that he sent out on April 14th, which is very important, is he signed his contract to retain Dick DeGuerin as his attorney. And usually the FBI doesn't talk about that he had, he was planning to come out. He had lined up an attorney to represent him.
Go to trial, yeah.
One thing I want to mention about Passover, during Passover, the agents continued to blast high decibel sounds at them. Steve Schneider complained about that because it was their sacred holiday. And, but on Good Friday, Steve asked for permission to go outside, walk over to the other side of the driveway in front of the front door, and light 7 canisters of what he called incense, 7 smoke canisters. And this was to honor the death of Jesus Christ on Good Friday. The FBI permitted him to do that, and then after Steve went back in, sometime after that, Jeffrey Jamar and Dick Rogers, the head of the HRT, they left a message with SIOC that they had decided that there was no plan to fight a fire should there be a fire. So as early as Good Friday during Passover, they decided they weren't going to fight a fire if one happened. Later that evening, an incident occurred where some of the operators in a tank beckoned Steve to come out. This was customary to come out and pick things up and take them back in the building. So Steve went out and they threw a percussion grenade at him, a flashbang grenade, and which scared him to death, and he went inside and called the negotiators, really, really angry and frightened. He was just out of his mind from fright. And this began a pattern of harassing the Branch Davidians whenever they would come out. They did come out of the building sometimes, and the agents would throw flashbang grenades at them. And there were other types of harassment, such as running a tank into the building and almost killing somebody who was sleeping in a bunk with his head next to the outer wall.
So basically at that point, if we go to April 14th, the fire's on the 19th, so Wednesday to Monday, that was that critical period. And then there's these things happening that we learned later in Washington, D.C.
Ah, yes. Things we knew nothing about at the
Thursday,
time.
Friday, Saturday, actually through the weekend. So I think we should talk about some of that. Now, the big thing from my standpoint, because I was involved, is that when the Attorney General, Janet Reno, was approached with the possibility of final approval for the gas plan, she asked repeatedly, this is in the FBI reports, well, first, before I approve it, is there any argument for waiting? Argument, not guarantee. Now this, to me, is the travesty of the whole thing. An argument for waiting would be, well, yeah, actually, here's a letter. There, you got it right there. Here, read this, General Reno, and these two Bible scholars, not that I want to be mentioned, but it could be anybody. And here's a tape that he responded to, and they've just signed their legal agreement on the exit. So, yeah, there's actually a very good possibility. And she would have said, well, is he writing the seal? Mm-hmm. And the true report would have been, yes, actually, he's finished the first in about 3 days.
By April 16th.
Yeah, by the 16th.
So about almost 2 days.
And we know that from the tapes we have, the negotiation tapes with the negotiators. I've never heard David happier listening to all those hours and hours and hours. He liked to joke. He said things like, you know, I haven't been like your average cult leader. I'm kind of a nice guy. And he'd laugh. And he's saying, I'm going to come out and I'll go to jail. You can feed me bananas and make fun of me and say, why does he have all these wives? And does he molest children? Remember, he's kind of joking around. But he also says things like, did you take a shower for me? You know, I can't wait to get out. And he said, did you eat a pizza? So there's that, but there's also the serious thing, because he says in that letter that he believes this revelation, because he's the second Messiah, he thinks, will be like the second Gospels, meaning he said it'll be as great as the Gospels.
Yeah, he says it'll be better than the 4 Gospels. And one time he writes, he says it'll be the most sacred information ever. Right. So for David as the Lamb, and since he's interpreting the 7 seals by means of the Old Testament and New Testament, when he writes the 7 seal message, it'll encapsulate in shorter form the entire corpus of Revelation. This is going to be another Bible. Right. And he was going to present it to humankind. Right. And he says, when you read it, you will see the King in his beauty. Yeah. It'll be a revelation of Jesus Christ. Right. Or of the Christ.
You know, I have in my notes too that when Daguerre came out after bringing this letter from David Koresh, that he talks to the FBI, and the FBI tells them that we have all the time it takes.
Yep,
in other words, we're not in a rush. We're not going to assault the place.
All the time.
Yeah, take your time. Let him write the 7 seals, and a few days later, the CS gas assault takes place.
And so early in the morning on April 16th, say around 2 a.m., this was after the tank had rammed the building. So I think the HRT was trying to distract him from his writing. But nevertheless, David gets on the phone to the negotiators, and I'm reading this in the log. And because a lot of times the statements made in the negotiations are just transcribed directly into the log. And so he reports that he's completed the first seal. And so the Branch Davidians start asking for word processing supplies. And they continued to ask, you know, all day on April 16th, they asked on April 17th, they asked on April 18th, and the word processing supplies were not delivered until the evening of April 18th, which is the night before the assault. So, actually in a recent documentary, Byron Sage said, if he had just sent out his commentary on the first seal, we would have known that he was working on it and we wouldn't have carried out that assault. But that's a very self-serving statement, because the FBI refrained from sending in the supplies they needed to type up the first seal. So to claim that David didn't send anything out, they couldn't send anything out until it was typed up and it was saved on a floppy disk.
And they did type it that evening. One of the things that is important to remember is David wanted to present the 7 seals, not the 1 seal. You know, there's 7. But in order to show good faith, to show that there's some give and take, the negotiators asked Steve Snyder, see if he would agree to send out 1, just to show that it's being done, because there's some skepticism by some of the higher-ups that how do we even know he's working on it? And David at first said, no, you know, it's a package. He said, when I come out and give it to, this would be going against what he said in the letter. And so then he said, he changed his mind. He said, okay, I will agree to send out the 1. And that's when, so we need the ribbons and the typewriter materials quickly because we got to get it out. So I think that's important to point out. Because he could have just said, no, I'm not sending it. And it'll be done when it's done.
So he compromised.
He compromised, yeah.
Showing good faith, compromise.
Well, the agents who were monitoring the surveillance devices had a system where if they heard anything of significance, it would be immediately referred to the special agent in charge. They would write it down and give it to him. So I don't buy that he didn't know. Actually, on April 19th, the Branch Davidians also tried to tell the agents that morning. They wanted to tell them about the progress that had been made in preparing the first seal.
And they said, we have it ready to send out.
We have it. Well, when the assault started at 6 a.m. in the morning, within 5 minutes, the telephone line to the negotiators was dead. Now, the agents have said that as soon as Byron Sage called in, told Steve Snyder that they were going to gas the place, tanks would be coming in, this is not an assault. The claim is that somebody threw the phone out the front door, disconnected, threw it out the front door. Graham Craddock, who's one of the survivors, and he sort of took care of the phones and the technical things in the building, he has testified, also given interviews, saying that the telephone was still there in the foyer where it had always been. He also said that even if the phone had been thrown out the front door, he had other phones he could connect. So at any rate, the surveillance tapes indicate that between 9 and 10, Steve Schneider's in the foyer, and he's directing Pablo Cohen and then Graham Craddock to go outside and show the FBI agents that the telephone line was broken, a tank had run over it. And Steve explicitly says, we want to tell the agents about the progress on the Seven Seals manuscript. But they worked on it for an hour. Byron Sage over the loudspeaker said, we see the line's broken, you've shown it to us, we're going to send you another telephone. And that never happened, and the assault proceeded. So you had combat engineering vehicles, which are just another word for tank, but they were driving into the building and spraying CS gas through their booms. And then HRT operators were using grenade launchers to fire in ferret rounds, which are little plastic rockets. And when they
missiles.
hit, little missiles.
They go through the wood, don't they?
Yeah, when they hit something like a wall or some
contact.
furniture, it bursts open and it released the CS gas. I think Stuart said earlier, CS is really a. Actually, you want to explain what CS is?
CS is a particulate powder, and so it covers everything. You know, when it settles, and it is flammable. And the manufacturers warn on the labels that it should not be used in closed spaces because it can be lethal. People can get chemical pneumonia. and die, and people have died from it. We have lots of cases in which people have died from exposure to CS in closed spaces, and yet they went in and gassed, used CS insertion for 6 hours.
Do you know how many they shot in those rounds?
I've seen those numbers in the past. I don't have them on the top of my head, but they literally.
There's a quote by some commander that one of you had about how many he personally
Shot in.
Oh,
remember?
93.
Yeah,
93
so there are
rounds.
hundreds going in, probably.
93 rounds.
Yeah, and that was just
by
one
guy.
by one guy.
So that's a lot, isn't it?
I would think so.
That's something to be proud of.
The CS powder was in a methylene chloride base, which also is flammable.
It shows up in the Congressional Investigative Report, because I've quoted that report before, that many of these people were probably unable to move. They were inert, basically. They were unconscious from all the
Well,
gas.
they had gas masks early on.
But the children didn't have
So-
gas
And
masks.
they didn't have gas masks for all the adults.
They didn't. And the children, no gas
No
masks.
gas
No
masks.
gas masks for the children.
Now, there were the congressional investigations that you three testified in, but there was another congressional hearing where they were talking about, well, okay, this happened, it's a terrible tragedy, terrible mistakes were made. What changes can be made in relation to the EPI in particular? And they had some former NYPD officers testify, and they said that as members of the New York Police Department, if they had a barricaded subject and children were involved, they would never use CS gas because children have small lung capacity and are less able to withstand the effects of the CS. So if the NYPD knows this, why doesn't the FBI know this?
So they started inserting the gas then, and the Branch Davidians refused to come out. I mean, this goes on for hours.
Well, it
6
went
hours.
on. Yeah,
So,
6
I mean,
hours.
10 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, the Branch Davidians are not coming out.
And the Branch Davidians, though, are trying to survive. They're dodging the ferret rounds, they're dodging the tanks, they're trying to survive. As soon as the tanks started coming in, the mothers, the two pregnant women and the small children were put in the safest part of the building, which was a former vault. It was a concrete room, and it had been a vault in a former building that had burned down. And Clive Doyle has told me that after that building burned down, I think in '83, all the contents of that vault were safe. His printing operation, all the printed tracts that he had printed were in there. They were not touched by the fire. It was an open door, faced the front of the building. So at 11:35, CEV drives through the building up to that open door and gasses the mothers and the children and the two pregnant women. Colonel Rodney Rawlings, the retired Army colonel, he told reporter Lee Hancock in 1999 that there was a bug nearby, so the FBI agents could hear the mothers and the children crying and praying. They knew they were in there, and they were sent in there to gas them. And the Branch Davidians were scattered in different places throughout the building, you know. Some people were in the chapel over to the side. There were people in the gymnasium in the back until a CEV came in and collapsed the roof. Then they had left the gymnasium area. There were people in the cafeteria probably trying to get out. There were the mothers and the children in the cooler, or what I call the vault. There were people on the second floor. Clive Doyle has said that his youngest daughter, Sherry, was in that second floor room of the central tower. And as he says, that was a cul-de-sac. There was no way to get out of there. David Koresh and Steve Schneider appear to have been somewhat on the southeast end of the building, on the second floor, but when the building burned, their bodies fell down to the first floor. next to the phone room in the foyer. So people were not in one place. They were scattered
Right.
throughout the building.
I see. The idea that the vehicle would locate the women and children and insert the gas directly on them brings to my mind the testimony of the driver of that vehicle. I heard him personally when I was in Washington for the congressional hearings. And he says that he located them and he inserted the gas, but he also talks about how careful he was to be sure he could get close enough to insert it properly. He actually saw them looking out that doorway. So it's a very deliberate act. And you could tell he felt some remorse because he mentioned that he was a good Christian man and just sort of doing his duty and hoping they would leave and run out safely.
And think about this, by demolishing the building, they destroyed exit, escape routes, they destroyed stairwells that collapsed. When I attended the trial, the wrongful death suit in 2000 in Waco, there were several Branch Davidian survivors, I think Marjorie Thomas maybe, and Misty Ferguson.
This is a civil suit.
This is a civil suit. Misty Ferguson, when she came to the witness stand, you know, they swore her in. She held up her hand to swear on the Bible, I guess, and she had no fingers. All of her fingers had been burned off on both hands because in trying to escape, she was grabbing burning wood that basically seared off all of her fingers. And she talked about how difficult it was to find a way out with all the collapsing structures and the debris that blocked any way of getting out. And so you've got to think that many of those people who wanted to get out couldn't.
One thing I'll say, the children, the small children, the oldest child was 13. So 13 and under were their mothers, and or maybe a big brother. There was a big brother in there. They were in the cooler or the vault. The people who escaped were in other parts of the building. It would have been impossible for them to get over and grab a child and come out. It would have been impossible to get up on the fire started on the second floor. Of course, it spread quickly, or possibly other fires were set. I don't know. I'm not a fire expert. But it would have been impossible for people on the first floor to get upstairs to the second floor to try to save people. Because the fire, it started on the second floor. And it started at 12:07 and consumed the building very quickly.
Everything's optimistic until Monday morning. Mm-hmm. And then this calamity happens. And from their religious point of view, the Bible prophecies of calamity are going to be fulfilled now because Babylon has rejected the message. Not only rejected it, but is preventing the new Bible from being released to humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. One counter voice among the survivors is Graham Craddock, an Australian. Mm-hmm. And his testimony is that he saw someone in the chapel pouring fuel on the floor. And Pablo Cohen protested that. He said, "Don't pour it here, pour it outside." And according to, Graham is the one who heard a shout. The way he heard the shout from the second floor is, "Light the fire." Pablo Cohen disputed that, said, wait, don't light the fire. Then a shout from the second floor said, don't light the fire. And then a little bit later, there was another shout, "Light the fire." And retired Colonel Rodney Rawlings, who was in a command center someplace, listening to the same audio from the bugs that the FBI agents were listening to, they also, according to him, they heard a similar order, counteract the order, and then the order again to light the fire. Now, the FBI special agent in charge, Bob Ricks, who came out and spoke at the press briefings, Immediately after the fire, he reported he heard a similar command: light the fire, don't light the fire, light the fire. But then later, he said, oh, I was mistaken. That's not what I heard. But it wasn't immediately, because he actually gave a speech to a Tulsa Rotary Club, and he gave that same account. But then after that, he said, no, I was mistaken, that's not what I heard. And so if that sequence of statements was recorded by a surveillance device, it's never been produced by the FBI.
What would be the implications if he had heard it? Is it that they could have then stopped?
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, the FBI could have somehow stopped what they were doing in order to prevent the fire from happening that they were hearing would maybe be started. And I would like to comment that if you're saying that there was an instruction to pour the fuel outside, that was preferred by, I think you said Pablo Cohen.
Pablo Cohen
wanted to pour it outside. If that were actually the intended location of the fuel that they were pouring, that strikes me as not an attempt to burn the building down, but it fits the religious idea that in the last days the people of God would be protected by a circle, a wall of fire around the community, not inside the city. So I'm thinking, Jim, of Zechariah, chapter 2 and verse 5, which is known to the Branch Davidian community.
It says, I will be unto her with a wall of fire round about.
Yeah, it's a wall of fire to protect you from the invading Babylonians. It's not inside to burn you and your families up. So I think under that duress of the FBI assault on the women and children, that was the final breaking point when David Koresh got to the point where he felt, you know, this is the crucifixion. This is the death of God's anointed. The Babylonians have resisted the publication of the true message, and now they're going to destroy us, the entire community. But now I'll have to unleash the winds of God's wrath, as the book of Revelation says. He's been told to hold back the winds of God's wrath, which he did for a long time, 50-something days. But now he's going to unleash the winds of God's wrath. It's going to start with building the wall of fire that would stop the FBI's assault, and then likely spread out and destroy the Babylonians. So it was no suicide, not even death by cop. I think they thought that God would protect them, just like he did the story in the book of Daniel, where the three Hebrew
Yeah, they're
youths,
walking in the middle of the fire. And
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Yeah, I think that's what they were trusting in.
Let me say this too. The primary source for the Simple Messiah series is a former member by the name of Mark Bro. And Bro was committed to sort of trying to take David Koresh down. And so he started making some pretty outrageous claims. And those are the things that were conveyed to the ATF, and I think account for the overreach and the exaggerated perception that ATF had. I mean, they showed up with 80 armed agents with three days of training at Fort Hood.
Armed.
Yeah, I mean, paramilitary assault with AR-15s and flak jackets and camo and Kevlar helmets, stun grenades, and sniper rifles. I mean, for a child abuse allegation, or?
The problem with the cult narrative as it's conveyed through the media and also in the assumptions of law enforcement agents, and certainly it's been promoted by FBI agents, the problem is that it promotes something that scholars call cult essentialism, so that if something bad happens, say people die, then according to that perspective, all the blame goes on the so-called cultists and the so-called cult leader. And what that does is it masks or covers up the fact that the violence occurred in an interactive situation. And this has been really the perspective that the FBI or the government in general wanted to convey to the public, This was the perspective argued in the criminal trial and also the wrongful death civil trial, that all the blame went on David Koresh, primarily, secondarily on the Branch Davidians, and that nothing the law enforcement agents did had anything to do with the deaths. So that's cult essentialism, and that's conveyed in the cult narrative, all the assumptions that go into the cult narrative that's out there in the general public.
And I wanted to add that one person's cult is another person's sincerely held religion. And as a historian, I take a wider view of this. Early Christianity was a cult, according to the Romans. They call it a cult. You have a charismatic leader who thinks he's talking to God. You have a group of highly devoted adherents who follow that leader. That's the definition people use for cult. The Baptists were considered a cult in the early days of the colonies. Any religion that's unknown, that's different, that's strange, it's what we call high demand, where people go 2-3 times a week and they really get into it and it changes their whole life. Start reading the New Testament. This is what I teach. High demand religion, Jesus says, leave your father, mother, brother, sister, sell everything and follow me. You'd say, well, that's what cult leaders say. So the problem is, who's going to pass out the label? And we're a country built upon the First Amendment, which is anyone can believe anything they want. If they break the law, then we deal with breaking the law. But you can believe anything you want in terms of who's the Messiah, who's not the Messiah, this or that. And if you remember the day of the fire, I'll never forget this, President Clinton had a press conference in the Rose Garden, and one of his statements just jumped out at me. He said, maybe this will be a warning to those who may be tempted to join cults. The fire, the fact that they're dead. And I thought, I think he just didn't think it out much. He's just reflecting what people say. And immediately I thought, is the government going to issue a list of approved and disapproved religions? Because the assumption was we would know, don't join one of those things. But they're highly devoted Mormons, they're highly devoted, there are Baptists that go to church 5 times a week. Is that a cult? They say, I give everything to Christ, I'm gonna do mission work. Is that a cult? So that's the problem I see with that label.
Yeah,
the media just runs with it.
Yeah, you're so right. I'm thinking of the 18th century, the 17th century, with the Puritans in Massachusetts, whipping the Baptists and hanging Quakers.
They called them a cult. Right?
Yeah.
If you're not the establishment, you're different, you're new, you're high demand. Those are the things.
Yeah, the first president of Harvard became a Baptist, and they drove him out of the colony. It may be a Jewish group that the Torah manuscripts are so important, you would never tear them and burn them up. Maybe a Catholic group where the Eucharist represents the body of Jesus Christ. You wouldn't stomp it on the floor. This would cause great offense. So with the Branch Davidians, I think what we were trying to do for the FBI was to help identify those things that the Branch Davidians held dear, so that the FBI would not make a mistake and violate some of those things that were precious to them and precipitate a crisis that could end in a fiery death.
I know when I teach my sociology of religion class, what I try to get across to my students is, in a lot of cases, I don't think that's true of the Branch Davidians, but in a lot of cases, we're talking about a first-generation religion. And the reason that new religions fascinate me to no end is it's sort of like it's a laboratory to study how religion gets born, how it's birthed, right? And a lot of these movements won't survive the death of the founder or the leader. There is no second or third generation, but oftentimes when there is a second or third generation, you realize that the second generation are not converts, but they're born into the religion, and that sets into motion a dynamic of institutionalization.
Well, I think you hit on it when you said, was it to improve ratings, to induce people to watch the coverage on television. In 2018, there were a whole slew of documentaries that came out. What do they want? They want viewers on the television channels. Or back in 1993, people were newspapers, they wanted to sell print newspapers. Now, newspapers are online, so what these newspapers want now are clicks, you know, so you can read the article but be exposed to a lot of ads. So cult stories attract readers.
There's another aspect to this. Back in the 1970s, when we started to see this kind of explosion of new religious movements in the late 60s and early 70s, we had the formation of organized opponents that eventually became tagged as the anti-cult movement. And those who were involved in this anti-cult movement specifically targeted these unorthodox, sometimes new, but not often, not always new, non-traditional religious movements, and used the term cult. And the term cult, as you guys know, got hijacked from its historical context and its meaning when it was described by, say, people like Ernst Troeltsch or Max Weber. And it became this, this term of derision, you know, and threat, and the term stuck, and it got in the popular consciousness as something that was always bad and evil. And we haven't been able to rescue that term from the popular consciousness, and we've almost kind of given up on the term and moved to more neutral terminology like new or non-traditional or unorthodox or alternative religions, because we can't seem to rehabilitate that term. So when I hear somebody use the term cult, the first thing I ask them is, define your term. What do you mean by cult? And they never can define it. They struggle because there is no real definition that matches this kind of evil, impressionistic term that people use, because it's not supported by the empirical research.
Well, what if they say to you, well, wait a minute, doctor, it's obvious a cult member is someone who has been brainwashed into their commitment. How do you all understand that term?
Well, sociologist James T. Richardson speaks of two myths that are associated with the pejorative use of the word cult. First is the myth of the omnipotent leader, and certainly that was the point of view that was promoted about David Koresh. That's what the FBI agents believed about David Koresh. It robs the believers of agency, you know, their own decision-making power. And that's the second myth that Dr. Richardson refers to, which is, he calls it the myth of the passive brainwashed follower. And social scientists have disproved the brainwashing thesis. People make decisions about joining movements due to a variety of reasons. Maybe they're friends with the people who belong to the movements. Maybe they're related to them. Maybe probably the worldview appeals to them. And sociologists have shown that you join a new movement. If someone joins a new movement, frequently they leave before long.
The American Psychological Association and the American Sociological Association formed investigative task forces to look into this concept because they wanted to introduce it into the social science language, mostly opponents or advocates of this term. And it was rejected roundly. The concept of brainwashing was rejected by the American Psychological Association, and the American Sociological Association is lacking any kind of scientific or empirical rigor. So it's not accepted as an empirical concept. It only exists as science fiction or in the popular consciousness of the people. So ask them to define brainwashing, and again, they will struggle to come up with any kind of term or concept or definition that would be satisfactory.
Our colleague, Eugene Gallagher, a Bible scholar, he points out that apocalyptic prophets, or people who believe in apocalyptic prophecies, always interpret the Bible's scriptures in light of the events and the context. So they might have certain beliefs, but they're not set in stone. People with an apocalyptic worldview, apocalyptic perspective, they're always reading the signs of the time. You know, what's going on around them? What's going on in society?
They're making adjustments.
they make adjustments to the prophecies, their understanding of the prophecies. So, yes, they had these beliefs. They had some beliefs that they might die in a fire, but that was not the foreordained conclusion of the siege. But the actions of the FBI agents in the very last minutes of that assault that they carried out on April 19th, not the first 6 hours, maybe the last 45 minutes, really the last 15 minutes, they might have decided that it was their time to die. So they, you know, even as the tanks are coming in, they're shooting in gas, CS gas, a very terrible type of gas, they were still interpreting the prophecies in light of everything that was happening to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one place David says, prophecies are warnings of things to come, that we might repent and change our ways, not cast in stone.
And church history is littered with prophetic failures, right? And many, many times we see, well, after the failure of a prophecy, the prophet will then reinterpret what happened, right? In terms of going forward. And one of the great contributions to the social science literature by Leon Festinger was to note that prophetic failure does not end the group, does not necessarily lead to the demise of the group, but they find a way to reinterpret or rework the narrative going forward.
But again, I keep going back to the question, okay, given that, whatever the circumstances were, how do we resolve a situation peacefully without loss of life that should have never happened in the first place? So now we're stuck, and we've got this 51-day siege. And regardless of what his views are about marriage or wives or children, how can it be resolved peacefully? And then, once he's out and in jail, which he expected to be, these issues can be dealt with legally.
Yeah,
they have to be dealt with legally, not
if we have
with
identified
guns.
their ultimate concerns as religious,
Yes.
then how could the FBI have used those ultimate concerns to resolve the crises peacefully? The FBI is thinking that they're going to try to resolve it by threat and by force and by denial. They don't want to deal with the religious ideology. But we have come to the point where we believe that that was the one way it could have been resolved, because these ideas were that important to them. They would not betray them, no more than a Catholic's going to betray the Eucharist. These are religious symbols to them.
Well, not all the FBI agents thought that they could resolve the situation through threat and violence and tactical actions. The behavioral scientists, the negotiators, wanted to resolve the situation through negotiations. And the negotiators will use a term which is saving face, Try to work out a resolution in which the subject is able to save face. Now, we religious studies scholars, we would use a different term, but I think it gets to the same thing, which is that these people have an ultimate concern, a concern that's the most important thing to them in the whole world. They'll live or die for it. The Branch Davidians were very clear that they would live and die for it if necessary. They didn't want to die, but they would die if the events transpired. And so we would say negotiate terms that enables them to remain true to their ultimate concern. Let David find some prophecies that will allow him to come out. And I think that's what the negotiators would understand as saving face.
Yes, it was very important then for the FBI not to precipitate the fulfillment of the prophecies that would lead to the conclusion of the fifth seal and the beginning of the terrible sixth seal. So I drove to Waco, and I did my best to go to the press conferences where the FBI was. It was very difficult to get in there. I was asked to leave by the Waco police and escorted out. I got back in, I talked to the agents. It was a difficult time to get anyone to actually listen. And even though I left business cards and gave my information to Bob Ricks, for example, really no interest was shown.
And you have a PhD in biblical interpretation, so
And I
it's not as though
explained
you're
that to
just
them.
some guy that shows up.
Yes,
you know.
I explained all that. And basically the comment I got was, you cannot understand this man. No one can understand David Koresh. He is speaking Bible babble. And 3 times I approached that agent. And 3 times he told me the same thing.
Just nonsense.
So
Gibberish.
just nonsense.
Yeah.
You cannot do anything to help at all. And so I knew then that we were going to have a tough time working through law enforcement because they wanted to keep the whole conversation on food, sending children out, milk, telephone contact, and when you're going to surrender. Whereas David was talking about his religious faith, that something eschatological and apocalyptic was happening in Waco, Texas.
Phil, if you remember, we felt at that point we need to get some teaching, really. We need to learn. And there was one of the people that was released, Livingston Fagan, who actually was a very well-educated theological scholar, Seventh-day Adventist school. I think he had a master's degree. And he was in jail in Waco.
Did Livingston say that it was inevitable that the rest of them would die, that the rest of the Branch Davidians would die?
No, there was not any idea of inevitability. Livingstone is saying that if the world will simply listen to the message and give them a chance to a fair hearing, then things would not end in calamity. But he did believe that if the world rejected the message and would try to attack the people of God, then God would exact vengeance for his people.
He thought it was a test.
Yeah, it's more of a test
for the world.
Yes, on the world. But what I don't understand, will never understand, is why didn't the authorities sit down with Livingstone Fagan and ask him, what is David Koresh thinking the prophecies are going to end in? What is the steps to resolve the crises
Or
according
teach us your
to
faith
their religious
so
beliefs?
we understand it.
They
Yeah.
did not do that. That's an abject failure on the part of law enforcement. So really, then the FBI misses that opportunity. That option they missed. They did not sit down and talk to Fagan. And they did not call me and ask, well, what did Fagan say? Although they knew for sure they could call me because they had called me about certain other issues when they wanted something. For example, there was another untried option in the middle of March. I had gone on the radio out of Dallas, giving just a brief discussion of what the 7 seals were all about. It so happens that the Branch Davidians heard that program that morning, and they called the FBI when they had the phone line hooked up for negotiations. And Steve asked the FBI agent.
Now explain who Steve is.
Oh, Steve Schneider was the right-hand man of David Koresh. He had a master's in theology. He did a lot of the talking on the negotiation tapes. A true believer, but someone who was trying to weigh the evidence and see how much he should follow Koresh's teachings and how biblical they were.
He was very
impressed,
sincere and
very
rational.
sincere and rational.
Yeah. Mhm.
And so he asked the FBI, he says, there's someone we heard on the radio, some fellow named Dr. Phil Arnold from Houston, Texas. He seems to know something about the 7 seals. Wonder if we could get he and David on the telephone together. And if Arnold can show us something that David doesn't know or has wrong, we will leave. We are out of here. And the agents never put me on the phone with David Koresh or Steve or anyone inside. That option was untried. They preferred, I guess, to insert CS gas first.
Well, not only were they not listening to you, advice from a Bible scholar, they were not listening to their own behavioral scientists. And so just like the two of you felt like you need to learn about the worldview, FBI agents were gathering intelligence about what David Koresh and the Branch Davidians believed. So in the Lee Hancock collection, which is in the archive at Texas State University, there are many, many memos about interviews with people who knew the Branch Davidians, current Branch Davidians, former Branch Davidians, family members of Branch Davidians. each one was written up in a memo, and then these were compiled reports. There were 4 compiled reports that were written. One was called Suicide References. That's dated March 27th. Then Passover's coming, so they compiled a series of references, statements from people they had interviewed. That document's titled Passover Summary. That's April 1st. Then on the day before the final assault, April 18th, you had a Passover addendum and a suicide addendum. And the people they interviewed had a consensus that David Koresh was not suicidal. Committing suicide was against his religious faith, but he had predicted that they would be assaulted and attacked, die, they would be killed. And so quite a few of the people that were interviewed stated the opinion that David Koresh was capable of setting up a suicide by cop scenario, a conflict in which the Branch Davidians would die. Then there were 2 behavioral scientists, Pete Smerick and Mark Young, who wrote a series of memos advising the FBI agents to pull back, don't apply pressure. If you pull back, you're taking power away from David Koresh because you're not fulfilling his prophecies. If you take an aggressive approach, children will die. And so they wrote 3 very strong memos telling FBI agents to pull back. But then finally, under pressure, they wrote a memo saying use aggressive tactics to break the spirit of David Koresh. But later they gave interviews internally to the FBI saying that that last memo was written under pressure. So
I'm surprised they agreed.
They did, unfortunately. So they had warnings from their own behavioral scientists. They had warnings from a Bible scholar on site who was trying to communicate with them. They even had warnings from Mark Brault. He kept calling, and finally the people in Australia were interviewed.
Ex-members, yeah.
Ex-members.
So be careful.
Everybody was telling them not to assault. It would be very dangerous if an assault was carried out.
Well, I've heard you quote Clive Doyle, one of the survivors, just the very logical thing that if you got the quote, but if David's deranged and the group's, mentally unstable, what was the... To me, that was so logical when I heard it.
In the movie, Waco Rules of Engagement, Clive states, if they thought we were all a bunch of crazies, a bunch of cultists, why did they push David and us to the edge? And then actually in the fictionalized 6-part Paramount miniseries titled Waco, the Gary Nessner character, played by Michael Shannon, said, he's talking to the character representing Jeff Jamar, and he says, you're taking a guy who's unstable, or you believe is unstable, and you're trying to drive him crazy to get him to cooperate.
Yeah, I think one of the big mistakes was when the FBI got the impression that David Koresh was conning them. And one time they give him an acid test and they speak to him and they say, well, one of the agents says, well, I'm very confident in my personal relationship with Jesus Christ, David. That was a test to see if David would say, well, wait a minute, I'm the Christ. You shouldn't be confident in Jesus. You should be confident in me. But David didn't say that. David was kind of gentlemanly about it. Well, I'm really happy that you have that relationship, There's more to learn about the 7 seals. And the agent thought, well, wait a minute. I know from my own religious perspective and my belief in Jesus that a real Jesus Christ-type figure would try to convert me. So that's an example of the FBI using their own religious presuppositions to make a value judgment. So they're not willing to open up to religious scholars to help them interpret the situation, but they were using their own religious presuppositions to interpret the situation. That's a fatal flaw.
I think there is 2 positive things to point to with regard to the FBI and the hostage rescue team, and jump in if you want to, Kathy, on this one. We saw changes in the structure of the FBI's hostage rescue team after Waco because they recognized that and I think that we can take some credit for this, I'm talking about the scholars, Waco scholars, in that because the crisis negotiation team didn't have the same voice, equal voice that the tactical team did, that the negotiation team was elevated to the same footing as the tactical team in future hostage barricade or crisis
situations. Did that get tested out then, the new policy?
It actually did get tested out a few years after Waco in Montana, involving a standoff with a sovereign citizen group called the Montana Freemen.
What year was that?
1996. And we saw the negotiators willing to talk to or include third-party negotiators. In fact, Phil and Kathy, I think, were there.
Well, they consulted with some scholars, including Michael Barkin. We weren't in touch with Michael at the time, but he was one of their consultants. And then Phil and I and Gene Rosenfeld, we provided advice to negotiators. The Critical Incident Response Group had already been created. Robin Montgomery was the first commander or director of SIRG. And as you mentioned, the negotiators were on equal footing with the hostage rescue team. They reported directly to the commander, who was Robin Montgomery. They met together. That was and also Gary Nessner was the head of negotiation at that time, and he got to implement all of the good negotiation techniques there.
Isn't that kind of wonderful that he,
It is, yeah.
taken off Waco, but then he gets
and look at the outcome of Montana. They waited 81 days for this group to come out, much longer. With regard to the media, I'm largely disappointed that with all these documentaries that I looked at on the 25th anniversary, and so many of them, they're just relying on simplistic cult stereotypes. They're leaning more towards salacious kind of tabloidish journalism. Surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, 4 of the 6 documentaries that I looked at didn't interview a single scholar. I mean, there's an enormous body of research now, research literature, peer-reviewed, published literature on Waco, and these journalists, filmmakers, basically didn't bother to even look at it.
Now, can I tell you a secret?
Sure.
2 of those 4 did interview. One of them,
that's right,
me, and the other, Dr. Arnold, extensively, 3-4 hours.
Oh.
Just like we've done today.
Okay.
And later called us and said, we've decided not to include any.
Oh my gosh.
Usually it would be like, really sorry we had to cut it a lot. It's not as much as we wanted. It's like, we decided not to go that route.
2 different networks.
2 networks. These are networks.
So essentially they made some kind of decision that they were going to go with the cult stereotype version, and you would have spoiled the party.
Yeah, they weren't talking about how it could have been resolved. They were talking about how weird and crazy these people are, and isn't this what happens when you have weird and crazy people? Let this be a warning to those who would be weird and crazy, that kind of idea.
I think they had a faith that they would be able to be protected through this thing. That is, that their lives were not over with. There was a future. They were going to return in power and glory. So this wasn't like a suicide pact. It was perhaps a translation into a different realm that they were feeling. But they also quoted the passage, I think it's in Isaiah, where you will run like through the flames, through flames. And in Joel, there's a confidence that God's army would be able to go through these types of problems, whether it be a fire or whatever. Also, they're building on this whole tradition in the Bible that the righteous remnant will suffer. I mean, you have that, the suffering servant in Isaiah for Israel. Jesus is crucified. So it's as if all these things, from the point of view of the Davidians, here at the very end, it looks like the end time scenario, all the parts that the prophecies predict are being played out by the individuals involved. They're the righteous group. David is the Messiah figure. You have the Messianic children. Then you have the authorities who are playing the role of Herod and Pilate and Caesar, bringing about the crucifixion of the community. So, ironically, the FBI, who surely doesn't want women and children and men and everyone to burn up, that's not their hope. They're hoping to resolve the crisis somehow, I would think. But they actually wound up playing the roles of Herod and Pilate and Caesar.
Mm-hmm. And as you pointed out, there'll be a resurrection afterwards. You know, David will be resurrected as the end-time Christ, leading an army of the 200 million martyrs of all the ages, those which will include the Branch Davidians who died, but and these the 200 million martyrs of all the ages who come back with David, they're the wave sheaf. They're the first of the first fruits, but they're also the living wave sheaf. Those Branch Davidian survivors who didn't die in the fire, but who gave their all for their faith in God and His prophecies. And so they'll be part of that wave sheaf also when the time comes. So there is a hope after that.
So many of them still, they believe that David will return then.
They do.
Just as the Christians believe Jesus would return, yeah.
The Branch Davidians were waiting on God. They were waiting to see what God had in store for them. I'm quoting one of the Branch Davidian women. And when the attack happened, especially after the children and mothers were gassed, I think probably the Branch Davidians felt like they had their answer about what God had in store for them.
Well, I'll say this from the standpoint of religious studies, and I think sociology and anthropology are the same. We consider this generally to be delusional thinking, that you can walk through fire, that you're going to fly up to heaven, simply because when people believe this sort of thing, they end up dead. Anything from I'll jump off a building and God will catch me or whatever. But so many cases throughout history of people who did believe these things, that you're foolish not to take into account, even if you think it's a delusion. They don't think it's a delusion. They think it's real. And so you can't judge it by a skeptical attitude. It's like, of course God's not going to destroy the FBI with an earthquake and David will call down the wrath. That's a joke to secular people, but it's not a joke to them. I could say, I'd like to say that I like that question about, well, let's say the 28th never happened.
All right.
There's no raid.
Okay, no raid.
David Koresh is living at the Mount Carmel Center. He's got 123 followers. I don't think it would have probably amounted to much. Maybe that will help my critics to know that I'm not a believer in this message. I think there were just so many liabilities depending on these imminent prophetic scenarios. I don't think they would have come up. Well, they haven't come about. Here we are decades later. None of what David said was going to happen has happened. And this is the history of what I study. I often start my classes, I said, I don't want to be cynical, but we're studying an idea that has a 100% failure rate. Keep that in mind. Nothing wrong with studying it. We're essentially documenting disappointment and, as you mentioned, when prophecy fails. That's what you wrote in your book, When the Millennium Comes Violently. This is what we want to understand it. And also, it's the foundation of our Judeo-Christian civilization and Islam. All of these movements began with this eschatological apocalypticism. Now, a lot of them have evolved. Episcopalians don't strike me today as
Or Methodist.
but they're reading a Bible that says the appointed time has grown very short. Give up your wives, give up what you have, right? So it's still part of our culture. That's why we study it. And there are people that come along that say, well, wait a minute. If Jesus said this and we believe in him, shouldn't we do it? Or if Isaiah said the Lord's going to shake the earth, say I'm Jewish, I read Isaiah 24, it's because we polluted the earth, then maybe this is a prophecy of what's happening. People can read the Bible for themselves now. It's in all the languages, so.
And see the signs of the times, right?
Signs of the times, yeah.
So I would have to agree that you wouldn't have had this great clash between the Branch Davidians and the citizens of Waco or the government that some people were thinking would happen had the raid not. I don't think they were going to use the weapons to harm anybody. They were just selling them at the gun shows. And they were preparing for prophecies that may happen in the future. If the apocalypse had not been delivered by the government, then you wouldn't have had the apocalyptic scenarios that unfolded. I do think, though, that we may have heard of the Davidians, the Branch Davidians, because I think David would still have thought of himself as having a messianic mission. And I would like to think that his love of music, remember now, that was how he was going to get his message out, was through music. That was what he was hoping to do. So he had musicians, many musicians with him, and he was a credible musician himself. And it just so happens, about a year after the raid's February 28th, 1993. So by August 1994, Woodstock is being held. Woodstock is being held. 500,000 people came to it. August 1994. All these rock bands. I think David Koresh would have been there with his rock band, performing as a messianic group. And he would have looked for converts. He would like to have persuaded some of those 500,000 people to follow him. If he got David Thibodeau and a few other musicians that he happened to meet in a bar, I got a feeling he would have grown his group through music, and that may have been the place he would have started. I think it would have just been good music. I don't think there would have been anything more than that happening.
Got a secret that I'd like you to understand. See the book there in the angel's hand, book of Daniel. It's got a message for you, a message for you. The angel cries as a lion begins to roar, secrets are told, mysteries in life to store. What's the thunder? Who knows? Don't you understand? Book is sealed. The angel stands on earth and the sea. Don't it make you cry? All that we can see the cloud, feel the rainfall. Don't you understand? Thunders, all heard the voice. Now you know mystery of life, mystery of life, oh. See the angel with a book in his hand, the book of Daniel. It contains the eternal plan, seven thunders. Won't you see? Won't you listen to me? We've got the key. In the days of the voice of the seventh angel, when it shall begin to sound, Babylon's gonna fall, gonna come to the ground.
So how's God going to talk to me in the latter days? He's going to be ready. And who's going to bring that book? So there'll be no excuses. In Psalms 40, you learn by the key of David, I waited patiently on the Lord. He inclined to me when he heard my cry. He brought me up out of a horrible pit and out of the miry clay, established my feet on a rock. Where's the rock at, class? Heaven. And established my goings. When Christ comes again into the world, is he going to walk in the light of his own mind or in the light of his Father's Word? Word. He put also a new song in my heart. Many shall see it and fear and trust in the name of the Lord. Why would that be? Right? Offering and sacrifice God does not require. My ears hast thou opened. Burnt offering and sin offering thou hast not desired. Then said I, one last offering, then said I, I come. In the volume of the book it is written of me, I delight to do thy will, O God. Thy love is within my heart. Well, Revelation says Christ's going to come with a what? And who wrote it? God. And what's it about? Right. The revelation of Jesus which God gave to who? Him. To show unto his servants things which must shortly come to pass. Now 2,000 years is not short. But when does Christ come? As soon as he receives the Lord. Of which John the Revelator stated clearly, this must be hereafter. Not the Catholic Church must be hereafter. Not the Lutherans or the Presbyterians or the Methodists or the Baptists or the Millerite or Adventists. Not all the theories of man. The gospel's fulfilled on the cross. Forgive them, they don't know what they do. Therefore, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you is the gospel and the power of it in Christ. Who's going to get what? There's going to be a judgment in heaven. Only one question. I don't care if you're into drugs. Drugs are bad. You should know you're into them. They're killing you. I don't care if you're an alcoholic. You know that alcohol is wrong. I don't care if you can't keep your marriage together. All I care about when I judge men is one thing. Do you want to know the seven seals? Do you want to know where they are?